The train's whistle cut through the afternoon heat like a knife through butter, sharp and insistent, announcing arrivals that would change lives forever. Caleb Mercer stood at the edge of Redemption Falls' single platform, dust settling on his worn boots, hat pulled low against the relentless Colorado sun. He wasn't there to meet anyone. He'd simply come to town for supplies, fence wire, lamp oil, the mundane necessities of a solitary life. But something had made him pause, some inexplicable pull that rooted him to that weathered planking as the locomotive hissed and groaned to a halt. The year was 1876, and Redemption Falls was barely worthy of the name town. A main street of packed earth, flanked by false-fronted buildings that pretended to be more substantial than they were. A general store, a saloon, a modest church, a hotel that had seen better days before it had seen any days at all. This was the edge of civilization, where people came to escape their pasts or build their futures, sometimes both. Caleb watched passengers disembark with the detached interest of a man who'd long ago stopped expecting anything from life beyond what he could wring from stubborn soil and ornery cattle. A drummer with sample cases, a family with too many children and too little luggage. An older gentleman whose Eastern suit marked him as hopelessly out of place. Then she appeared. Time didn't slow. That would suggest something gradual, poetic. Time stopped. Simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. One moment Caleb was breathing, blood moving through his veins in its regular rhythm. The next, everything inside him locked up like a seized engine. Lydia. 18 years collapsed into nothing. The woman descending those train steps wore a traveling dress of dark blue, modest and road-worn, her hair swept up beneath a simple bonnet. She moved with careful precision, one gloved hand on the rail, the other clutching a small carpet bag that seemed to contain everything she owned. But it was her face that destroyed him. Older, yes, finer lines around her eyes, a certain hollowness in her cheeks that spoke of hardship. But unmistakably, impossibly, Lydia Hart. His Lydia. Except she'd never been his, had she? Not really. Not when her father had sent her east to live with relatives after the war started. Not when letters stopped coming. Not when months turned to years and Caleb had finally accepted that whatever they'd shared as young people in a world that no longer existed had died with that world. He should have walked away. Should have turned on his heel and headed straight for his horse, ridden back to his ranch, and pretended this moment never happened. Instead, his feet carried him forward, moving without conscious instruction, closing the distance between past and present. Lydia? His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by shock and 18 years of disuse when it came to speaking her name aloud. She turned, and for a heartbeat, he saw recognition flash across her face, saw her eyes widen, her lips part in something that might have been the beginning of his name. Then something else took over. Not quite fear, but something adjacent to it. A wariness that cut deeper than any knife. Caleb. Not a question. A confirmation. An acknowledgement of a ghost made flesh. I didn't expect... No. He forced himself to breathe, to remember how human interaction worked, removed his hat, held it against his chest like a shield. I reckon you didn't. I didn't expect... Hell, Lydia, they told me you were dead. Who told you that? Your cousin, Thomas. He came through in '62, said your whole family had been taken by fever. You included. A bitter smile touched her lips, entirely devoid of humor. Thomas always was a liar. Efficient one, though. I suppose it was easier than explaining the truth. The platform had mostly cleared now. The conductor called last warnings to departing passengers. The train's engine built up steam, preparing to continue its westward journey. Caleb was peripherally aware of these things, but they happened in some distant reality that had nothing to do with the woman standing 3 feet away, close enough to touch, impossibly far. What truth? He asked, though part of him screamed not to. Some truths were better left buried. Lydia glanced toward the hotel, where a man stood on the porch, tall, severe-looking, watching their interaction with the cold assessment of someone evaluating property. She squared her shoulders, and Caleb recognized the gesture. She was gathering courage for something. I came west to marry, she said quietly. That's Mr. Whitmore. Samuel Whitmore. He placed an advertisement back east for a wife. I answered. We've been corresponding for 3 months. The words hit like physical blows. Caleb actually took a step back, needing distance from the reality they created. You came all this way to marry a stranger? Yes. Her chin lifted slightly, defiant despite the obvious discomfort. Is that so hard to understand? Lydia, He stopped himself, aware they were being watched, aware that whatever he said next would matter. Can we talk? Just for a few minutes. Please? She glanced again at Whitmore, who'd descended from the porch and was making his way toward them with measured, proprietary steps. I don't think that's wise, Caleb. What's done is done. What's past is— 5 minutes, he interrupted, surprised by the desperation in his own voice. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes before you do this. Miss Hart? Whitmore's voice carried across the remaining distance before he did, smooth, educated, with an edge that suggested he was a man accustomed to being obeyed. I trust your journey was tolerable? Mr. Whitmore? Lydia's tone shifted, became more formal, carefully neutral. Yes, thank you. Quite tolerable considering the distance. Whitmore reached them, and Caleb found himself being assessed by pale blue eyes that missed nothing. The man was perhaps 50, well-dressed in a way that spoke of money, with the kind of refined features that suggested he'd never worked with his hands a day in his life. Everything about him screamed civilization, Eastern breeding, the kind of man who belonged in a parlor, not on the frontier. And who might this be? Whitmore asked, though the question was directed at Lydia, not Caleb. An old acquaintance, Lydia said quickly. From before the war, Mr. Caleb Mercer. Caleb, this is Mr. Samuel Whitmore. Mercer. Whitmore didn't offer his hand. You have business with my intended? The possessiveness in that phrasing made Caleb's jaw tighten. Just offering welcome to town. Didn't realize Miss Hart was spoken for. Well, now you do. Whitmore placed a hand on Lydia's elbow, the gesture superficially courteous but unmistakably controlling. Come, my dear, I've arranged rooms at the hotel. We'll have dinner, discuss the arrangements for tomorrow's ceremony, and— Tomorrow? The word burst from Caleb before he could stop it. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Is there some reason that concerns you, Mr. Mercer? Caleb looked at Lydia, searching her face for— what? Protest? Fear? Some sign that this wasn't what she wanted? But her expression had gone carefully blank, revealing nothing. No, he forced himself to say. No concern of mine. I wish you both. I hope you'll be happy. It was perhaps the greatest lie he'd ever told. Whitmore seemed satisfied. He guided Lydia away, her carpet bag in his other hand, leading her toward the hotel like a man who'd just completed a successful business transaction, which, Caleb supposed with sick certainty, was exactly how Whitmore viewed it. Lydia glanced back once, just before they reached the hotel steps. Her eyes met Caleb's across the dusty street, and in that brief moment, he saw everything she hadn't said: apology, regret, resignation. Then she turned away, and the moment shattered. Caleb stood there long after they'd disappeared inside, hat still in his hands, heart hammering against his ribs, like it was trying to escape the cage of his chest. Around him, Redemption Falls went about its business. Horses at the water trough, men hauling freight, the general murmur of life continuing as if the world hadn't just turned inside out. You look like someone kicked you in the gut with spurs on. The voice came from his right. Caleb turned to find Sheriff Tom Briggs leaning against a post, a hand-rolled cigarette between his fingers, watching with the patient interest of a man who'd seen too much of life to be surprised by anything. Tom. Caleb managed the name, though his throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. That woman something to you? Tom asked. Not unkindly. Was. Long time ago. Before the war? Yeah. Tom took a long drag, exhaled smoke into the afternoon heat, and now she's about to marry Samuel Whitmore. Hell of a coincidence. You know him? Know of him. Moved here about a year ago. Bought the old Henderson place out past Copper Creek. Big spread. Bigger than he can work himself, which is why he brought in those laborers from back east. Keeps to himself mostly. Comes to town for supplies, pays his bills, doesn't cause trouble. But? Caleb heard the unspoken reservation. Tom shrugged. But nothing, really. Just something about him feels off. Can't put my finger on it. Man's too controlled, too careful. Like he's always performing, never quite real. He paused, studying Caleb's face. You planning to do something stupid? Like what? Like riding out there and making this complicated for everyone involved. Caleb forced himself to breathe evenly. She made her choice. Not my place to interfere. That's remarkably mature of you, Tom said dryly. Almost makes me think you mean it. I do. Another lie, though this one even Caleb didn't quite believe. Tom nodded slowly, crushed out his cigarette under his boot heel. Well, if that changes, do me a favor and tell me before you do anything. Rather not have to arrest you for disturbing the peace or whatever fool thing you might be contemplating. Noted. But Caleb was already moving, heading toward where he'd tied his horse, needing to put distance between himself and this town, this impossible situation. He swung up into the saddle, pointed the mare toward home, and rode. The ranch sat 7 miles outside Redemption Falls, carved from land that hadn't wanted to be tamed. Caleb had bought it with his mustering out pay and everything he'd saved during the war, such as it was. 160 acres of stubborn earth, a cabin he'd built himself, corrals and outbuildings in various states of repair. It wasn't much, wouldn't impress anyone looking for security or comfort. But it was his, paid for with sweat and blood and the kind of relentless determination that was either admirable or pathological, depending on who you asked. He went through the motions of evening chores automatically, fed the horses, checked on the dozen cattle he was nursing back to health, repaired a fence section that had started to sag. Physical work usually helped, gave his mind something to focus on besides the thoughts that circled like vultures. Tonight, it did nothing. Lydia was here, in Redemption Falls, alive. The magnitude of it kept hitting him in waves. For 18 years, he'd carried her memory like a wound that had scarred over but never quite healed. He'd built an entire life on the foundation of her absence, convinced himself that what they'd had was just youth and proximity and the heightened emotions of a world tearing itself apart. Time and distance had a way of making even the most profound feelings seem foolishly overblown in retrospect. Except seeing her again had proved every bit of that to be lies he'd told himself to keep functioning. He'd been 17 when they met, she 16. The world then had still felt comprehensible, operating according to rules that made sense. Her father had owned a farm adjacent to his family's property in Missouri. They'd grown up in the same church, attended the same social gatherings, existed in the same small orbit of people who knew each other's business and histories going back generations. Caleb had noticed her the way boys notice girls, as mysterious creatures who'd suddenly become interesting for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. But it had been a particular Sunday in spring when everything shifted. He'd been helping her father repair a fence line, and she'd brought them water. Their hands had touched as she passed him the dipper, and something electric had passed between them. Recognition on a level that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with something deeper, more fundamental. After that, they'd found excuses to see each other, chance meetings that were anything but chance, conversations that started about nothing and stretched for hours. He'd kissed her for the first time under an oak tree during a church picnic, with half the county within shouting distance and his heart hammering so hard he thought everyone must surely hear it. They'd made plans. Foolish, beautiful plans the way young people do when they think the future is something they can control. He'd work his father's farm, build something of his own. She'd wait for him. They'd marry when he turned 20, old enough to be taken seriously, build a life together in the only world they'd ever known. Then Fort Sumter happened. Then everything that followed. Caleb had enlisted with the Missouri Volunteers, driven by the same fever that had driven so many young men, the certainty that this would be settled quickly, that he'd be home by harvest, that missing it would mean missing the defining moment of his generation. He'd been so goddamn stupid. The letters had come regularly at first. Lydia wrote about home, about ordinary things that became precious when you were sleeping in mud and watching boys die of diseases with unpronounceable names. He wrote back when he could, though he never told her the truth about what war actually was. How could you explain that to someone you loved? How could you find words for the way a man's face looked when a rifle ball took him in the chest? For the screams in the hospital tents? for the gradual erosion of everything you'd thought you believed about humanity and honor and the fundamental rightness of the universe. The letters had slowed after the first year. His because he'd run out of lies, hers because, well, he'd never known why. Not then. By the second year, they'd stopped altogether. He tried to write, tried to reach her, but nothing came back. Then Thomas had shown up with news of the fever, and Caleb had believed it because believing she was dead was somehow easier than believing she'd simply stopped caring. He'd finished the war, survived it, at least, which was more than could be said for too many. Returned home to find his father dead, the farm sold for debts, nothing left of the life he'd known. So he drifted west like so many others, looking for land cheap enough to afford and empty enough that the ghosts couldn't follow. Apparently the ghosts had their own plans. Inside the cabin, Caleb lit a lamp against the gathering darkness and sat at the rough table he'd built. Tried to eat the simple meal he'd prepared. The food sat like stones in his stomach, and after a few bites, he pushed it away. She was marrying Whitmore tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word kept repeating in his mind, each iteration more impossible than the last. How could she marry a stranger? How could she bind herself to a man she'd only known through letters? It didn't make sense. The Lydia he'd known had been smart, cautious, not given to rash decisions. But that was 18 years ago, a voice in his head reminded him. People change. You changed. Why would she be any different? He thought about what Tom had said about Whitmore. Something feels off. Those 3 words shouldn't have carried the weight they did, but Caleb found himself unable to shake them. He'd learned during the war to trust instincts about people. It had kept him alive more than once. And something about the way Whitmore had looked at Lydia, the proprietary way he'd touched her elbow, made Caleb's skin crawl. You're just jealous, another part of his mind argued. You're looking for reasons to interfere because you can't stand the thought of her with someone else. Maybe. Probably. Almost certainly. But what if it was more than that? The question gnawed at him through the long evening and into the night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling beams he'd hewn himself, listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie at night, wind, distant coyotes, the creak of the house settling. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lydia stepping off that train, saw the wariness in her expression, saw the careful blankness that had descended when Whitmore appeared. Around midnight, he gave up the pretense of rest and returned to the table, lit the lamp again, stared at the ring of light it cast in the darkness. 5 minutes, he'd asked for. 5 minutes to talk. She'd refused, and maybe that was for the best. What would he have said anyway? What words existed that could span 18 years and the entirety of lives lived separately? Except he knew, didn't he? Knew exactly what he'd say if given the chance. I never stopped loving you. The thought arrived with the force of revelation, though it shouldn't have been surprising. Of course he'd never stopped. You don't stop loving someone just because time passes or circumstances change. You might bury it, convince yourself it doesn't matter anymore, build a life on top of it like a grave mound. But the love doesn't die. It just waits. And now? Now it was clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Dawn came cold and clear, the sky bleeding pink and gold over the eastern horizon. Caleb had been awake for hours, moving through chores with mechanical precision while his mind worked the problem from every angle. The smart thing would be to stay out of it. Let Lydia make her own choices. She was a grown woman who'd survived 18 years without him. Clearly, she didn't need him riding to any rescue. His showing up now would only complicate things, possibly make them worse. It would be selfish, self-indulgent, the act of a man who couldn't accept reality. He told himself all of this while he saddled his horse, told himself he was being a fool while he pointed the mare toward Redemption Falls, told himself to turn back with every mile that passed beneath the horse's hooves. He kept riding. The town was quiet when he arrived, too early for much activity. A few shopkeepers sweeping stoops, the smell of coffee from the hotel's dining room, morning birds making their usual racket. Caleb tied his horse outside the general store and stood there, trying to manufacture the courage to do what he'd ridden 7 miles to do. Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Tom Briggs emerged from the sheriff's office, coffee cup in hand, expression knowing. Just needed supplies, Caleb said, the lie thin enough to be transparent. Uh-huh. And the fact that Whitmore and Miss Hart are getting married this afternoon has nothing to do with it? This afternoon, I thought it was this morning? Yeah, so did I. Apparently Whitmore wanted to give his bride a chance to rest, get properly settled. They're having the ceremony at 3 at his ranch. Preacher's riding out there around 2. Tom took a sip of coffee, studied Caleb over the rim. You planning to attend? Wasn't invited. That wasn't what I asked. Caleb looked away toward the hotel. I need to talk to her before she does this. And say what exactly? I don't know, something, anything. He turned back to Tom, knowing he must look desperate and not caring. Tom, you said something felt off about Whitmore. What did you mean? The sheriff sighed, set down his coffee on the porch rail. Caleb, look, I like you. You've been a good neighbor, kept your nose clean, haven't caused problems. But if you're asking me to give you ammunition to break up a wedding, I can't do that. Whatever I feel about Whitmore, it's nothing concrete, just a feeling. And feelings aren't grounds for interfering in people's lives. I'm not asking you to interfere. I'm asking you to tell me if you think she's safe with him. That changed something in Tom's expression. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Honestly, I don't know. Like I said, he keeps to himself, pays his bills, but he hesitated. I went out there once, a couple months back. Had a report that one of his workers had gotten injured, might need help getting to the doctor. When I arrived, Whitmore met me at the property line. Wouldn't let me past. Said the worker was fine, just a minor accident, already been tended to. Made it real clear I wasn't welcome. That's not illegal. No, it's not. But it struck me as odd. Most folks out here, they're glad to see the law when there's trouble. Makes them feel safer. Whitmore acted like I was trespassing, like he had something to hide. Tom picked up his coffee again. Could be nothing. Could be he's just private. Or could be something else entirely. No way to know unless someone gives me cause to look deeper. The implication was clear. Without a complaint or evidence of a crime, Tom's hands were tied. Caleb's weren't. I'm going to talk to her, he said, before the ceremony. I need to know she's making this choice freely, that she understands what she's doing. And if she tells you to mind your own business, then I will. Probably another lie, but Tom didn't need to know that. The sheriff nodded slowly. All right, but Caleb, be careful. Whitmore struck me as the type who doesn't like interference. And he's got resources, connections. This goes sideways. It could go real sideways, real fast. Noted. Caleb left Tom on the porch and crossed to the hotel. The clerk at the desk, a nervous young man who looked barely old enough to shave, watched him approach with obvious apprehension. Help you, sir? I need to speak with Miss Lydia Hart. She's a guest here. Oh, The clerk glanced toward the stairs, then back at Caleb. Miss Hart she's with Mr. Whitmore. They're having breakfast in the dining room. Then I'll wait. I'm not sure that's... I'll wait, Caleb repeated, with enough edge that the clerk wisely decided not to argue. He stationed himself in the lobby, hat in hands again, feeling like a fool but unable to make himself leave. Guests came and went. The clerk pretended to be busy with paperwork while occasionally shooting nervous glances in Caleb's direction. The clock on the wall ticked away minutes that felt like hours. Then Lydia appeared at the top of the stairs. She was alone, which surprised him. Descending carefully, one hand on the rail, wearing a different dress than yesterday, this one a soft gray that brought out the blue of her eyes. She saw him immediately, and something flickered across her face too quickly to identify. Caleb? She reached the bottom step, stopped there, maintaining distance. What are you doing here? I need to talk to you. We talked yesterday. No, Whitmore talked. You barely said 3 words. He took a step closer, lowered his voice. Lydia, please, just give me 10 minutes. If after that you still want to marry him, I'll never bother you again. She glanced toward the dining room where Caleb could now hear Whitmore's voice discussing something with the hotel proprietor. When she looked back, her expression had softened slightly, though wariness remained. There's a small garden behind the hotel, she said quietly. 5 minutes, that's all. Thank you. He followed her through the lobby and out a side door into what the hotel optimistically called a garden, Really just a small courtyard with a few struggling plants and a bench beneath a cottonwood tree. Lydia sat on the bench, arranged her skirts carefully, waited. Caleb remained standing, suddenly unsure how to begin now that he had the chance. "You said they told you I was dead," Lydia said when the silence stretched too long. "Thomas told you that?" "Yes. In 62. Said fever took your whole family." "My family did die," she said softly. "Just not from fever. And not all at once." She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "My father died at Shiloh. You probably knew that. It was in the casualty reports." Caleb hadn't known. He'd stopped looking at casualty reports after a while, couldn't bear to see how many names he recognized. "I'm sorry. My mother lasted 2 more years, grief, mostly, though the doctor called it something medical. My brother enlisted the day after Father's funeral, determined to avenge him or die trying. He accomplished the latter at Cold Harbor." Her voice remained steady, but Caleb could hear the cost of that steadiness. "By the war's end, it was just me." "You went to your relatives in Boston, that much I knew." "Yes. Uncle Martin and Aunt Claire. They took me in, which was generous considering they could barely support their own family. I worked in their shop, helped with the children. Made myself useful so I wouldn't be a burden." She finally looked up, met his eyes. "I wrote to you, Caleb, after my mother died. Sent the letter to the last address I had, care of your regiment." The words hit like a physical blow. "I never got it." "I know, I realized eventually. By then, I'd heard you were dead too. A cousin of yours came through Boston, said you'd been killed at Petersburg. So I stopped writing to ghosts and tried to build a life." The symmetry of it was cruel. Both of them grieving the other, both moving forward believing the past was truly dead and buried. "What happened?" Caleb asked. "Why come west? Why answer an advertisement from a stranger?" Lydia's expression hardened slightly. "Because I'm 34 years old, unmarried, with no family and no prospects. My uncle died last year and his son inherited the shop. His wife made it clear I was no longer welcome. I had $60 to my name and nowhere to go. So when I saw Mr. Whitmore's advertisement, widower seeking companionship and help managing household, offering security and respectability in return, it seemed like the best option available." "The best option? Lydia, you don't even know him." "I know he's offering me a home, security, a place in the world. What more do I need to know?" There was defiance in her voice now, but underneath it, Caleb heard something else. Resignation. Defeat. "You need to know if he's a good man, if he'll treat you well, if he'll love me." She laughed, a bitter sound. "Caleb, I'm not a girl anymore, dreaming about romance and happily ever afters. I'm a woman trying to survive. Love is a luxury I can't afford." "That's not true, isn't it?" She stood abruptly, facing him squarely. "What's your alternative? What are you offering that's better than what Mr. Whitmore can provide?" The question hung between them, demanding an answer Caleb wasn't sure he could give. He looked at this woman he'd loved for half his life, saw the lines hardship had carved around her eyes, the steel that survival had forged in her spine. She deserved more than he could offer, more than his rundown ranch and uncertain future. But he couldn't let her do this, not without trying. "I'm offering the truth," he said finally. "I'm offering the chance to choose something because you want it, not because you have to. I'm offering—" He stopped, gathered his courage, said the words he'd crossed 7 miles to say. "I'm offering everything I am, everything I have. It's not much, Lydia. It's a cabin that needs work and land that fights me every step and a future that's anything but certain. But it's yours if you want it. You're not alone in the world. You've never been alone. Because I've been here the whole time, loving you like a fool loves. Too much and too long, and with no sense of when to quit." Silence fell between them, broken only by the rustle of cottonwood leaves and distant sounds from the street. Lydia's eyes had gone bright with unshed tears, but her voice stayed steady when she spoke. 18 years ago, that would have been everything I wanted to hear. But 18 years ago is gone, Caleb. We're different people now, strangers, really, who happen to share a past. We're not strangers. Aren't we? What do you know about who I am now? what I've survived, what I've had to do to keep going. She shook her head. You're in love with a memory, with a girl who doesn't exist anymore. Then let me learn who you are now. Let me... Miss Hart? They both turned. Whitmore stood in the doorway, his expression pleasant, but his eyes cold as they assessed the scene. Mr. Whitmore, Lydia said, smoothing her skirts in a gesture that seemed more about composing herself than fixing her appearance. I was just getting some air. Mr. Mercer was kind enough to keep me company. How thoughtful. Whitmore's tone suggested he found it anything but. I do hope Mr. Mercer wasn't imposing on your time. We have much to discuss regarding this afternoon's arrangements. Not at all, Lydia said quickly. Too quickly. We were just finishing. She moved toward Whitmore, who extended his arm. She took it, and Caleb watched her disappear back into the hotel, watched the door close between them with a finality that felt like a door closing on any possibility of changing her mind. He stood there in the garden, holding his hat, feeling the weight of words unsaid and chances missed. 5 minutes. She'd given him 5 minutes, and he'd used them to bare his heart, only to have it firmly, gently rejected. The smart thing would be to accept it, ride home, let her make her choices, move on with his life. Caleb had never been particularly smart. The afternoon crawled toward 3 o'clock with agonizing slowness. Caleb spent it in the saloon, nursing a whiskey he didn't really want, trying to convince himself that showing up at Whitmore's ranch would be the height of foolishness. You look like a man contemplating something that'll end with him in my jail, Tom said, sliding onto the stool beside him. Just having a drink. Uh-huh. And plotting how to disrupt a wedding, I'd wager. Caleb didn't confirm or deny it. Tom signaled the bartender for his own drink, waited until it arrived before speaking again. I can't stop you from riding out there. It's not illegal to attend a wedding, even uninvited, but I strongly advise against it. Noted. Caleb, I have to try, Tom. I have to know I did everything I could. Otherwise, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what if. The sheriff sighed, knocked back his drink in one swallow. Then at least wait until after, show up for the reception or whatever they're having. That way, if things go sideways, it's less likely to be during the actual ceremony. It was solid advice. Caleb ignored it. He left the saloon at 2:30, gave Tom a nod that was part apology, part farewell, and headed for his horse. The ride to Whitmore's ranch took 40 minutes, following the road north until it branched toward Copper Creek, then following that track into increasingly rough country. The ranch itself was impressive. A large house, well-built outbuildings, extensive corrals. Clearly, Whitmore had money and wasn't shy about spending it. Caleb counted at least 6 horses in the corrals, saw workers moving between buildings, glimpsed cultivated fields beyond. This was what Lydia would have if she married Whitmore. Security, comfort, a future free from the kind of hardship that had marked her recent years. And what did Caleb offer in comparison? A drafty cabin and promises made from desperation? He almost turned around, almost convinced himself that disrupting this would be selfish beyond measure. Then he saw her. Lydia stood on the porch of the main house, wearing what must be her wedding dress, a simple cream-colored gown that looked new, probably purchased by Whitmore. The preacher stood beside her, Bible in hand. Whitmore faced them both, his back to the arriving Caleb. The ceremony had already begun. Caleb dismounted, moved closer on foot, staying far enough back to avoid immediate notice. He could hear the preacher's words drifting across the yard. Gathered here in the sight of the Almighty to join this man and this woman. Standard words, nothing remarkable about them, except they were binding Lydia to a stranger, and Caleb found he couldn't breathe properly. The preacher continued, asking about impediments, about objections, following the familiar ritual. Caleb waited for someone to object, waited for Lydia to object, knowing it was foolish but hoping anyway. No one did. Do you, Samuel Whitmore, take this woman? Caleb's hands clenched into fists. This was it. The moment. After this, she'd be legally bound. After this, any interference would be not just inappropriate but potentially criminal. He should leave. Should respect her choice. Should... And do you, Lydia Hart, take this man? Lydia's voice, when she spoke, was so quiet Caleb almost missed it. I do. 2 words, that's all it took. 2 words, and everything Caleb had hoped for shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The preacher pronounced them married. Whitmore lifted Lydia's hand, kissed it with a formality that looked more like a business agreement being sealed than any expression of affection. Then he turned, saw Caleb standing there. For a moment, nobody moved. Lydia's face went white. The preacher looked confused. Whitmore's expression shifted from surprise to something darker. "Mr. Mercer," he said, voice carrying across the yard, "I don't recall extending you an invitation." "Didn't need one to wish the happy couple well," Caleb managed, though the words tasted like ash. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, but he maintained his composed demeanor. "How thoughtful. As you can see, the ceremony is concluded. We'd offer refreshments, but I'm afraid we're keeping things quite private." A dismissal. Clear and unmistakable. Caleb looked past Whitmore to Lydia. She was staring at him with an expression that combined horror, apology, and something else he couldn't quite identify. But she didn't speak. Didn't contradict her new husband. Just stood there, frozen. "My congratulations, then," Caleb said. He settled his hat back on his head, nodded to the preacher. "Reverend?" He walked back to his horse with measured steps, refusing to hurry despite every instinct screaming at him to run. Mounted up, turned the mare back toward the road. He didn't look back, couldn't bear to. The ride home passed in a fog. Caleb went through the motions, guided the horse, maintained his seat, kept moving forward, but he was operating on pure automation, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of might-have-beens and too-lates. Night had fallen by the time he reached his cabin. He tended to his horse, moving through the familiar routine without really seeing what he was doing. Fed her, brushed her down, made sure she had water and hay. The normalcy of it all felt obscene somehow, the universe continuing to function as if everything hadn't fundamentally changed. Inside, he didn't bother with a lamp, just sat in the darkness at his table, staring at nothing. She was married. The thought kept circling, refusing to be absorbed. Lydia was married to Samuel Whitmore, was sleeping under his roof, bound to him by law and custom and vows she'd spoken willingly. And Caleb had stood there and watched it happen, had let it happen. The rage came later, after the numbness wore off. Rage at himself for waiting 18 years, for believing she was dead, for not searching harder. Rage at Thomas for lying. Rage at the war that had destroyed everything. Rage at Whitmore for being able to offer what Caleb couldn't. Rage at Lydia for choosing security over love. Except it wasn't really rage at her, was it? How could he blame her for making the practical choice? For choosing survival in a world that gave women so few options? He couldn't. Which left him with nothing but his own failure to rage against. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally won over emotion. Caleb collapsed into bed, still dressed, and fell into a sleep haunted by memories of a girl in a blue dress stepping off a train, over and over, each time moving further away no matter how fast he tried to reach her. He woke to pounding on his door. For a disoriented moment, he thought he was back in the war, that the pounding was artillery, that he needed to move before the next barrage. Then reality reasserted itself. His cabin, dawn light through the window, someone hammering at his door with enough force to shake the frame. Caleb stumbled upright, crossed to the door, yanked it open. A boy stood there, maybe 12 years old, gasping for breath like he'd run the entire distance from wherever he'd started. His eyes were wide with fear. "You Caleb Mercer," he demanded. "Yeah. You gotta come. Mrs. Whitmore, the new Mrs. Whitmore, she sent me, said to find you and give you this and you'd know what to do." The boy thrust a piece of paper at Caleb, folded and sealed with wax that had been hastily applied, already cracking. Caleb took it with hands that had started to shake. "When did she give you this?" "Last night. Late. She snuck it to me when Mr. Whitmore wasn't watching, said wait till morning and ride hard to find you." Caleb broke the seal, unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Lydia's. He'd have recognized it anywhere. But the words made his blood run cold. "Caleb, I was wrong. So wrong. This is not a marriage. It's a prison. The children are terrified. I am terrified. He won't let us leave. Please. If you ever loved me, help us. L." He read it 3 times, each word burning into his mind. Then he looked at the boy. "Are you one of Whitmore's workers?" "Yes, sir. I help in the house mostly, cleaning and such." "What's your name?" "Daniel, sir." "Okay, Daniel, I need you to tell me everything. What's happening at that ranch? Why are the children terrified, and why can't you leave?" The boy glanced over his shoulder like he expected Whitmore to materialize out of thin air. When he looked back, his young face was etched with the kind of fear that came from genuine danger. "Mr. Whitmore, he's not right, sir. He has rules, so many rules. You break them, you don't eat, or worse." Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "His daughters, they're not allowed to talk unless spoken to. They're not allowed outside without permission. They have to ask before doing anything, and if he says no, that's it. No arguing." "His daughters?" Caleb's stomach dropped. "Lydia's with his children?" "Yes, sir. 2 girls. Sarah's 9, Emma's 7. Their mother died a year ago, and they've been like ghosts, sir, just moving through the house, trying not to be noticed." "And Lydia?" Daniel's expression grew pained. "She tried to talk to them last night, after the ceremony. Mr. Whitmore told her it wasn't her place, that he'd handle discipline and household management. When she argued, The boy stopped, swallowed hard. "He what?" "He grabbed her arm, hard enough to leave marks. Told her to remember her place. Then he locked her in her room, said she'd stay there until she learned proper respect." The rage that had simmered in Caleb all night ignited into something focused and burning. "Where is she now?" "Still locked in, far as I know." "Mister, Whitmore left early this morning to check the far pasture. That's when I snuck out. But he'll be back soon, and if he finds out I came here—" Caleb was already moving, grabbing his gun belt, checking the loads in his revolver with practiced efficiency. "Daniel, you're going to stay here. You understand? Don't go back." "But sir, if Mr. Whitmore finds out—" "He won't. Not from you. Now tell me exactly where Lydia's room is and where the children are kept." As Daniel detailed the layout of Whitmore's house, Caleb felt something settle over him, the same cold clarity that had gotten him through the war. He'd failed Lydia once by being too late. He wouldn't fail her again. This time, he'd be exactly on time. And Samuel Whitmore was about to learn that some men didn't back down when dismissed. Some men came back with purpose. The 7 miles between Caleb's ranch and Whitmore's property had never felt longer. He pushed his mare hard, but not recklessly, knowing that arriving exhausted and careless would help no one. Daniel's words played on repeat in his mind. The locked room, the marks on Lydia's arm, the terrified children moving through their own home like prisoners. Each detail added fuel to the fire burning in his chest. The sun was climbing toward midday when Caleb finally saw the outline of Whitmore's ranch against the horizon. He slowed his approach, circling wide to come at the property from the north where a line of cottonwoods offered cover. Daniel had said Whitmore rode out to check the far pasture. That would put him on the southern end of the property, buying Caleb time. But how much time was anyone's guess? He dismounted in the tree line, tied his horse where she'd be hidden, but could be reached quickly if needed. Drew his revolver, checked it again, though he'd already done so twice. The weight of it in his hand felt both familiar and foreign. He hadn't drawn on another man since the war, had hoped never to again. But some situations left you no choice. The house sat quiet in the morning heat. Caleb could see smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, heard the distant clang of someone working in the blacksmith shed. Workers moved about their business, but there was something off about it, a tension in the way they moved, like animals aware of a predator nearby. Daniel had sketched a rough layout of the house. Lydia's room, the room Whitmore had locked her in, was on the 2nd floor, eastern side. The children's room was across the hall. Getting to either meant going through the main entrance or finding a window, and the windows on the 2nd floor were too high to reach without a ladder. Front door it was then. Caleb approached the house from an angle that kept him out of sight of most of the windows. His boots made soft sounds on the hard-packed earth. Every instinct honed by years of survival screamed at him that this was reckless, dangerous, likely to end badly. He ignored those instincts. Sometimes the only way forward was straight through. He reached the porch, tested the first step carefully. It held without creaking. The second did the same. At the door he paused, listening. Voices from inside, female, one older and one younger. The housekeeper, probably, and one of the daughters. His hand settled on the door handle. It turned easily. Out here, most folks didn't lock their doors during the day. The door swung open with barely a whisper. The interior was as impressive as the exterior, fine furniture, polished floors, the kind of carefully maintained prosperity that spoke of money and control. Caleb moved through the entrance hall, following the sound of voices toward what appeared to be the kitchen. A woman in her 50s stood at a large stove, stirring something in a pot. Beside her, a small girl with dark hair braided tightly against her skull was shelling peas with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested she'd been doing it for hours. Both looked up as Caleb appeared in the doorway. The housekeeper's hand flew to her chest. "Mercy, who are you? How did you—" "I'm a friend of Mrs. Whitmore's," Caleb said quietly, holstering his revolver to appear less threatening. "I need to see her." "Mrs. Whitmore is indisposed," the woman said, recovering her composure with visible effort. "Mr. Whitmore left strict instructions that she wasn't to be disturbed." "I'm sure he did. I'm disturbing her anyway." The little girl, this had to be Sarah or Emma, had gone very still, her hands frozen over the bowl of peas. Her eyes were enormous in her thin face, and Caleb could see the fear there. Not fear of him exactly. Fear of what his presence might mean, what consequences might follow. "Please," the housekeeper said, and now there was something other than outrage in her voice, something that sounded almost like hope. "Mr. Whitmore will be back soon. If he finds you here." "Then he finds me here. Where's her room?" The housekeeper exchanged a glance with the child, some wordless communication passing between them. Then she sighed, the sound carrying the weight of a decision made. "Top of the stairs, third door on the right. It's locked." "I assumed. Where's the key?" "Mr. Whitmore has it. On his person always." Of course he did. Caleb studied the housekeeper's face, saw the conflict there, loyalty to her employer warring with something else. "What's your name?" "Mrs. Chen." "Mrs. Chen, how long have you worked here?" 6 months, since Mr. Whitmore arrived." "And in those 6 months, have you seen him treat those children with any kindness, any warmth?" The question hung in the air. Mrs. Chen's silence was answer enough. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Caleb said. "I'm here to help someone who needs it. You can try to stop me, or you can look the other way. Your choice." Another long moment of silence. Then Mrs. Chen returned her attention to the stove, stirring with renewed focus. "I've gone temporarily deaf, it seems. Can't hear a thing. Strange affliction." Caleb nodded his thanks and headed for the stairs. The second floor was quieter still, hallway carpeted to muffle footsteps. Caleb counted doors, third on the right. He tried the handle, found it locked as expected. Pressed his ear to the wood, listening. Movement inside. Footsteps. Then Lydia's voice, muffled but audible. "Who's there?" "It's Caleb." A sharp intake of breath. "Caleb? How did you— You shouldn't be here. If Samuel finds you—" "Got your message. I'm getting you out." "The door's locked. He has the key." "I noticed." Caleb stepped back, assessed the door. Solid wood, well made, but the lock was standard residential hardware, nothing that would stand up to real force. "Step away from the door." "What are you—" He didn't wait for her to finish, drew back and kicked hard just beside the lock mechanism. The frame splintered with a crack that echoed down the hallway. Second kick, and the door burst inward. Lydia stood in the middle of a well-appointed room that somehow managed to feel like a cell. She wore the same cream dress from yesterday, now wrinkled and stained. Her hair had come partially loose from its pins, but it was her eyes that struck Caleb, red-rimmed from crying, but burning with something fierce and unbroken. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I came." He crossed to her in 3 strides, caught her hands in his, saw the bruises on her wrists where Daniel had said Whitmore grabbed her. The sight made his vision narrow with rage. "Did he hurt you anywhere else?" "No, just, he locked me in. Said I needed time to reflect on my duties as a wife." Her voice shook. "Caleb, this was a mistake. A terrible mistake. I thought I was being practical, choosing security. But this isn't security. It's— I know, Daniel told me." He released one of her hands but kept hold of the other, anchoring them both. "Where are the children?" "Their room, across the hall. He hasn't let them out since last night either. Said they needed to learn not to bother the adults with their presence. The cold rage in Caleb's chest crystallized into something harder, sharper. Show me. They crossed the hall together. This door was unlocked. Apparently Whitmore felt his daughters required less security than his new wife. Or perhaps he simply enjoyed the psychological cruelty of a lock that could open but chose not to. Lydia pushed it open slowly. Two small girls sat on a narrow bed, holding hands. They looked up with identical expressions of fearful hope when the door opened. Both had their father's pale eyes, but where his were cold and assessing, theirs were simply empty. The kind of emptiness that came from having emotion beaten out of you, figuratively or literally. Sarah? Emma. Lydia's voice gentled. This is Mr. Mercer. He's a friend. We're leaving. The older girl, Sarah, with her mother's dark hair, shook her head minutely. Father won't allow it. Your father doesn't get a say in this, Caleb said. He crouched down to put himself at their eye level, made his voice as unthreatening as possible. You're right that he won't like it, but sometimes we have to do things people don't like because they're the right things to do. And getting you out of this house is the right thing. Emma, younger and smaller, looked at Lydia. Are you really leaving? You just got here. I am, and I'm hoping you'll come with me. Lydia moved to sit beside them on the bed, gathered both girls into her arms with a naturalness that spoke to some deep maternal instinct. I know you don't know me, I know you're scared, but I promise you, wherever we go will be better than here. Anywhere would be better than here, Sarah said quietly, and the adult weariness in her child's voice broke something in Caleb's chest. Then let's go. He stood, moved to the window, checked the view. The yard remained quiet, no sign of Whitmore returning, yet. We need to move fast. Get whatever you need. Clothes, anything important. 1 bag each. We've got maybe an hour before your father gets back. 30 minutes, Sarah corrected. He always comes back for the midday meal. Always. Caleb checked his pocket watch. 11:40. That gave them 20 minutes, maybe less. Then we move faster. Go. The girls scattered with surprising efficiency, pulling items from drawers and a small trunk at the foot of their bed. Lydia moved to help them, but Caleb caught her arm gently. You need things too. Whatever you brought with you, anything you'll need. She glanced back toward her room, Whitmore's room, really, and her expression hardened. I don't want anything from there. Nothing he touched. Lydia, I have the clothes on my back. That's enough. She met his eyes, and he saw steel there he'd never seen before. This wasn't the girl he'd known before the war. This was a woman who'd survived things he couldn't imagine, who'd been bent but not broken. Let's just go. They made it down the stairs, the girls carrying their hastily packed belongings, Lydia's hand tight in Caleb's. Mrs. Chen was still in the kitchen, still studiously ignoring everything happening around her. As they passed, she pressed something into Sarah's hands, a cloth bundle that smelled like fresh bread. For the journey? She said quietly. Then to Caleb, there's a path through the north pasture, faster than the main road and less likely to be seen. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just get them somewhere safe. Her eyes met his, fierce and urgent. He won't let this go, you understand that? He'll come after them. Let him try. They were halfway across the yard when Emma tugged on Lydia's sleeve. Wait, we forgot Billy. Who's Billy? Caleb asked. Her rabbit, Sarah explained. Father said she couldn't keep it, but she hid it in the barn. We don't have time, Sheke, Caleb started, but the look on Emma's face stopped him. The child was 7 years old, escaping from what amounted to a prison, and she was worried about a rabbit. Where in the barn? I'll show you. Emma darted toward the large structure before Caleb could stop her. He swore under his breath and followed, Lydia and Sarah close behind. The barn was dim and smelled of hay and horses. Emma led them to a back stall where a hutch had been cleverly hidden behind some feed sacks. Inside, a brown rabbit with floppy ears looked up at them with philosophical calm. Got him, Emma said, scooping the animal into her arms. Okay, we can go now. They were turning to leave when the barn door slid shut with a bang that echoed like a gunshot. Samuel Whitmore stood silhouetted against the daylight, blocking their exit. He'd traded his wedding clothes for work gear, denim and leather, practical rather than refined. But there was nothing practical about the shotgun cradled in his arms. "Well," he said, voice carrying that same smooth pleasantness that somehow made it more threatening. "Isn't this cozy? My wife and daughters attempting to leave without so much as a goodbye, and accompanied by Mr. Mercer, who apparently has difficulty understanding when he's not welcome." Caleb stepped in front of Lydia and the girls, hand moving toward his revolver, but Whitmore raised the shotgun fractionally, a clear warning. "I wouldn't. Scattergun beats a pistol at this range, and you know it." He was right. At 15 feet, that shotgun would cut Caleb in half before he could clear leather. Caleb's hand stilled, though it didn't move away from his weapon. "This doesn't have to get ugly," Caleb said. "No? Then what did you expect? That you'd waltz into my home, steal my wife and children, and I'd simply wave goodbye?" Whitmore's pleasant tone never wavered, which made it all the more chilling. "You've broken into my house, destroyed my property, and are now attempting to kidnap my family. I'd be well within my rights to shoot you where you stand." "She's not your property," Caleb said. "Neither are those girls. Actually, legally speaking, they are precisely that. My wife and my daughters bound to me by law and custom. You, on the other hand, are a trespasser and a thief." "I asked him to come." Lydia's voice rang out clear and strong as she stepped from behind Caleb, refusing to be shielded. "I sent for him because you locked me in a room like a criminal, because you told me my place was to obey and be silent, because your children are terrified of you." "Well, they respect me," Whitmore corrected. "There's a difference. Respect requires discipline, structure, things you clearly don't understand." "What I understand is that you're a cruel man who hides behind respectability. You wanted a wife to manage your household and give your daughters a mother, but what you really wanted was another person to control." Something flickered in Whitmore's expression, anger, quickly suppressed. "You've been here less than a day. You know nothing about what I want or what this family needs." "I know enough. I know those girls flinch when you raise your voice. I know you grabbed me hard enough to leave bruises when I dared question you. I know that you locked your own wife in a room for the crime of showing basic human compassion to children who've lost their mother." The shotgun's barrel lowered slightly, pointing now at the ground between them rather than directly at Caleb. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Sarah, Emma, come here," Whitmore commanded. Neither girl moved. They stood frozen behind Lydia, Emma still clutching her rabbit, both of them trembling. "I said, come here." "No." The word came from Sarah, barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of every ounce of courage the 9-year-old possessed. "We're going with Mrs. Whitmore." "You'll do no such thing. You're my daughters—" "You made Mother cry," Emma said suddenly, her small voice cutting through Whitmore's words. "Every night. We heard her. You made her sad until she got sick and died." The accusation hung in the air, raw and devastating. Whitmore's composed mask finally cracked, something ugly and furious showing through. "Your mother was weak. She refused to understand the importance of order, of proper behavior. If she'd simply listened, if she'd been obedient—" "If she'd been obedient, she'd still be alive?" Lydia interrupted. "Is that what you were going to say? That her death was her own fault for not submitting to your control? I provided for her, gave her everything she could possibly need. This house, security, status, everything except kindness, except love, except basic human dignity." Lydia's hands had curled into fists at her sides. "You can't buy those things, Mr. Whitmore. You can't control them into existence. And you can't lock people up until they learn to perform whatever version of family you've decided is acceptable." "Enough!" The shotgun came back up, and all the false pleasantness had burned away, leaving only cold rage. "You'll return to the house. All of you. We'll discuss this matter privately, and then Mr. Mercer will leave and never return. Those are your options." "No." Caleb had been watching, waiting for the right moment. It came now, as Whitmore's attention focused entirely on Lydia, his anger making him sloppy. "There's another option." He moved fast, faster than Whitmore expected from a man standing still, closed the distance, got his hand on the shotgun's barrel, forced it up and away. The weapon discharged, deafening in the enclosed space, buckshot tearing into the barn's roof. Hay and splinters rained down. Then they were struggling, Whitmore trying to wrench the gun free. Caleb refusing to let go. They crashed into a support beam, both grunting with effort. Whitmore was taller, but Caleb had 40 pounds on him and years of hard labor that had built practical strength. "Run!" Caleb shouted at Lydia. "Get them out of here!" For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then survival instinct kicked in. She grabbed both girls, pulled them toward the small side door Daniel had mentioned. Emma dropped her rabbit in the scramble, cried out, but Lydia kept moving, kept dragging them toward safety. Whitmore saw them going, tried to twist free, screamed, "Stop! You can't—" Caleb slammed him backward into the beam again, hard enough to drive the air from Whitmore's lungs. The shotgun finally came free, clattered to the floor. Caleb kicked it away, heard it skitter across the packed earth into shadow. "Your wife just left you," Caleb said, breathing hard. "Your daughters chose her over you. Maybe that tells you something about the kind of man you are." Whitmore's response was to drive his fist into Caleb's ribs. Pain exploded, sharp and immediate. Caleb staggered, and Whitmore pressed the advantage, landing another blow to his jaw that sent him reeling. They fought like animals then, no technique or strategy, just raw desperation. Caleb had fought in the war, knew how to survive violence. But Whitmore fought with the fury of a man whose control had been challenged, whose carefully constructed world was crumbling. A wild swing caught Caleb above the eye. Blood ran hot down his face, blinding him on one side. He responded instinctively, drove his shoulder into Whitmore's midsection, took them both to the ground. They rolled through hay and dirt, each trying to gain position. Caleb ended up on top, pinned Whitmore's shoulders, drew back his fist, and stopped. Whitmore lay beneath him, nose bleeding, lips split, eyes blazing with impotent rage. He was beaten, and they both knew it. Caleb could end this now, could beat the man unconscious, maybe kill him if he didn't hold back. But killing him would solve nothing, would make Caleb no better than the violence he'd spent years trying to leave behind. "It's over," Caleb said, shoving himself upright. His ribs screamed protest, and his head throbbed where Whitmore had struck him. "They're gone. Let them go." Whitmore rolled onto his side, spat blood. "This isn't over. You assaulted me in my own home, stole my wife, took my children. I'll have the law on you so fast." "Then do it. Get the sheriff. Tell him everything. Tell him how you locked your wife in a room, how your daughters are terrified of you, how your first wife died under suspicious circumstances." Caleb wiped blood from his eye, found his hat where it had fallen. "See how well that plays." He retrieved the shotgun from where it had fallen, broke it open, removed the remaining shell, tossed the weapon into a far corner where it would take Whitmore time to retrieve it. Then he headed for the side door, pausing at the threshold. "You wanted a family," he said without looking back. "But families aren't built on control and fear. They're built on trust. Love. Things you clearly don't understand. Maybe use this time to figure out why everyone you claim to care about can't wait to escape you." He didn't wait for a response, stepped out into the sunlight, closed the door, and ran. Lydia and the girls were waiting by the tree line where he'd left his horse. All three looked up as he approached, their faces a mixture of relief and fear. "Is he—" Lydia started. "He's alive. Angry, but alive." Caleb untied his horse, started to mount, then stopped as the world tilted sideways. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving pain in its wake. His ribs felt like someone had driven a spike between them. The cut above his eye wouldn't stop bleeding. "You're hurt." Lydia was beside him instantly, her hands gentle on his face, assessing the damage. "Caleb, you're bleeding badly." "I'm fine. We need to move. He'll recover soon, and when he does—" "Mrs. Chen said there's a path north," Sarah volunteered, "through the pasture to the old mining road. It's faster than the main route." Caleb looked at the 9-year-old who'd just escaped her prison of a home and was now calmly suggesting tactical routes. The resilience in these children was staggering. "Sarah's right," he agreed, "but it's 7 miles to my place, and we'll all have to ride together. Can you manage?" "We can manage," Lydia said firmly. She lifted Emma onto the horse first, then Sarah behind her. "Where do you want me?" "Behind me. Hold on tight." She mounted with the kind of practiced ease that spoke to a childhood before circumstances had made her desperate enough to answer strangers' advertisements. Her arms came around his waist, careful of his injured ribs, and the rightness of it struck him even through the pain. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." They rode hard through the north pasture, following fence lines and creek beds that would hide their trail. The mining road Sarah had mentioned turned out to be little more than a track worn into the landscape by prospectors decades past, but it was passable, and it pointed them toward safety. Behind them, Caleb could imagine Whitmore emerging from the barn, discovering his family truly gone, his control shattered. The man would come after them. Of that, Caleb had no doubt. Men like Whitmore didn't accept defiance. They doubled down, escalated, turned loss into warfare. Let him come. Caleb had survived worse than one angry man with delusions of ownership. Emma started crying quietly about a mile out, still mourning her abandoned rabbit. Sarah comforted her sister in whispers, their small bodies pressed together for warmth and reassurance. Lydia's grip on Caleb tightened, and he felt her trembling, reaction finally setting in now that immediate danger had passed. "You okay back there?" he asked. "I married him yesterday." Her voice was barely audible over the horse's hooves. 24 hours ago I took vows, promised to honor and obey, and now I'm running away like a thief." "You're not a thief, you're a survivor." "Am I? Or am I just someone who makes terrible decisions and expects other people to fix them?" Caleb guided the horse around a washout, chose his next words carefully. "Yesterday, you made the best choice you could with the information you had. Today, you're making a better choice with better information. That's not terrible decision-making. That's being human. He'll say I abandoned my marriage, that I broke vows before they were even a day old. He locked you in a room, Lydia, grabbed you hard enough to bruise. That breaks any vow I can think of." They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun climbed higher, turning the day hot and bright. Caleb's head throbbed in rhythm with the horse's gait. His ribs protested every bounce and jar. But he kept them moving, pushing toward the dubious safety of his ranch. They crested a rise, and his cabin came into view, small and rough and nothing like Whitmore's impressive house. For a moment, doubt seized him. What was he offering these people? A drafty cabin barely big enough for one person, let alone four. No proper beds for the children. Limited supplies. And the certainty that Whitmore wouldn't let this stand, that there would be consequences neither simple nor easily resolved. "It's perfect," Lydia said softly. He glanced back at her. "It's falling apart. It's freedom. That makes it perfect." They reached the cabin to find Daniel sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood with nervous energy. He jumped up as they approached, his young face flooding with relief. "You got them! I was worried when you didn't come back right away that Mr. Whitmore had—" "He tried." Caleb dismounted carefully, every muscle protesting. "Daniel, I need you to do something for me. Ride into town, find Sheriff Briggs, tell him what happened. Tell him everything about the locked room, the children, all of it." "But sir, if I tell the sheriff, he'll have to—" "I know, but I'd rather get ahead of this than wait for Whitmore to spin his version. Tom's a good man. He'll listen." Daniel nodded slowly, though fear still shadowed his features. "What about me? Where do I go after?" Caleb hadn't considered that the boy would need refuge too. "You're one of Whitmore's workers?" "Was? I don't reckon I can go back there now." "No, I don't reckon you can." Caleb looked at the boy. Maybe 12, maybe younger, already carrying the weight of adult choices. "After you talk to Tom, come back here. We'll figure something out." Daniel's shoulders relaxed fractionally. "Yes, sir. I'll be quick." He headed for the horse Caleb provided, mounted up, and rode toward town with the kind of determined speed that came from having a clear purpose. Lydia had already gotten the girls down from the horse and was ushering them toward the cabin. Caleb followed more slowly, his body finally registering all the damage Whitmore had inflicted. Inside, Lydia took one look at him and pointed to a chair. "Sit." "I need to—" "Sit." There was steel in her voice that left no room for argument. "You're bleeding, you're probably concussed, and I can see from how you're moving that your ribs are damaged. Sit down before you fall down." He sat. She moved with practiced efficiency, locating his meager medical supplies, heating water, gathering clean cloth. The girls hovered uncertainly until Lydia gave them tasks. Sarah to find blankets, Emma to check if there was food that needed cooking. They scattered, grateful for purpose. Lydia knelt in front of Caleb, began cleaning the cut above his eye with gentle precision. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the fine lines that spoke of too many hard years. But there was also strength there, a determination that no amount of hardship had managed to break. "This is going to need stitches," she said. "I've got a needle and thread somewhere." "Of course you do." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You always were prepared for anything. Not for you walking off that train." The smile faded. "Caleb, I'm sorry. For yesterday, for all of this, for dragging you into—" "Stop." He caught her hand, stilled it against his face. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I came because I wanted to, because seeing you again made me realize I'd been half alive for 18 years, just going through motions. You woke me up. I'm married to another man." "Are you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, that marriage lasted less than a day and ended the moment he locked you in a room. No piece of paper makes that legitimate." "The law might disagree." "Then we'll deal with the law." He released her hand, let her return to tending his wounds, one problem at a time. She worked in silence, her touch gentle despite the necessary pain of cleaning and stitching. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, studied her handiwork. "Not my best work, but it'll hold." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We're in serious trouble, Caleb. You know that, right? Whitmore will press charges, kidnapping, assault, theft. He'll throw everything at you he can, and legally, he's got grounds. I'm his wife. Those are his children. You did break into his house. Let him try. I'd rather face the law than let you and those girls spend another day in that place. Even if it costs you everything, your ranch, your freedom?" "Even then." She stared at him, searching his face for something, doubt perhaps, or regret. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met, or the most foolish." "Can I be both?" That ghost of a smile returned, stronger this time. "I suppose you can." Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's only one bed." "We'll make do," Lydia assured her. "You and Emma can have the bed. Mr. Mercer and I will manage on the floor." "You take the bed," Caleb corrected. "All three of you. I've slept on harder surfaces." They argued about sleeping arrangements while Emma investigated the cabin's sparse furnishings with the curiosity of a child who'd been locked away too long. She found Caleb's small bookshelf, pulled down a volume of poetry, began sounding out words she knew. "She reads?" Lydia asked, surprise evident. "Our mother taught us," Sarah said quietly, "before she got too sick. Father said reading was a waste of time for girls, but we practiced in secret." The casual mention of more small cruelties made Caleb's jaw tighten. How many other restrictions had Whitmore imposed? How many small freedoms had he stolen from his own children? The afternoon wore on. They found food, dried beans, some salted pork, flour for bread. It wasn't much, but Lydia transformed it into something approaching a meal with the kind of resourcefulness born from years of making do. The girls ate like they'd been starved, which perhaps they had been, at least emotionally. As evening approached, Caleb found himself watching this makeshift family moving through his cabin, filling it with life and sound in ways it had never known. Emma's quiet questions, Sarah's careful observations, Lydia's capable hands turning his bachelor quarters into something approaching a home. This is what he'd wanted, he realized. Not the specifics. He'd never imagined himself suddenly responsible for 2 traumatized children and a woman technically married to another man. But the essence of it, the feeling of not being alone, of mattering to someone, of building something that meant more than mere survival. He told himself for years that he was content with solitude. That after the war, after losing Lydia, he'd earned the right to live quietly without complications. But contentment and happiness weren't the same thing, and he'd confused one for the other for far too long. A rider approached as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Caleb tensed, hand moving to his revolver, then relaxed as he recognized the silhouette. Tom Briggs, with Daniel riding behind him. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his weathered face unreadable in the fading light. Daniel scrambled down and hurried toward the cabin, clearly eager to be out of the line of fire if there was about to be trouble. "Tom," Caleb said evenly. "Caleb." Tom's eyes took in the scene, Caleb's battered face, Lydia visible through the cabin window, the two small girls watching from the doorway. "Heard you had an eventful day." That's one word for it. "Whitmore's already been to see me, made some serious accusations, breaking and entering, assault, kidnapping, says you stole his wife and children at gunpoint." "Is that what he said?" "It is. Want to tell me your version?" So Caleb did. He laid it out plainly. Daniel's message, finding Lydia locked in her room, the bruises on her wrists, the terrified children, Whitmore's cold rage and colder control. He didn't embellish or excuse, just stated facts and let them speak for themselves. Tom listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away. When Caleb finished, the sheriff was quiet for a long moment. "That's quite a story," he said finally. "It's the truth." Whitmore's version sounds very different. In his telling, you're an obsessed former lover who couldn't accept that Mrs. Whitmore rather, had moved on. He says you've been harassing her since she arrived, that today you broke into his home and threatened his family. "And you believe him?" Tom's eyes met Caleb's steadily. "I didn't say that. But here's the problem, Caleb. Belief and law aren't always the same thing. Legally, Whitmore's got a case. They were married yesterday, proper ceremony, all legal and binding. Those girls are his daughters. And you did break into his house, did fight with him, did take his family without his consent. He locked Lydia in a room, which is unfortunately not illegal when it's a man's wife in his own home. The law sees wives as belonging to their husbands. Wrong as that may be, it's how things stand." Caleb felt cold dread settling in his stomach. "So what happens now?" "Now I'm supposed to arrest you, take you in, let a judge sort it out." Tom paused, glanced toward the cabin again. "That's what I'm supposed to do." The emphasis on supposed was slight but significant. "But you're not going to?" Caleb asked carefully. "I'm going to think about it. Going to talk to Mrs. Whitmore, see if her story matches yours. Going to have a conversation with those children without their father looming over them." Tom settled his weight more comfortably, clearly preparing for a longer stay. "Might take me a day or two to complete my investigation. A lot of ground to cover, a lot of witnesses to interview. Wouldn't be right to make an arrest before I have all the facts." Understanding dawned. Tom was buying them time, giving Caleb a chance to figure out next steps before the law came down. "Thank you, Tom." "Don't thank me yet. This is a temporary measure at best. Whitmore's not going to wait patiently while I conduct a leisurely investigation. He's got money, connections. He'll go over my head if he has to, bring in federal marshals or territorial authorities. You've got maybe 2 days before this becomes bigger than I can manage." 2 days is 2 days. We'll use them." Tom nodded, then fixed Caleb with a serious look. "One more thing. You need to understand what you're up against. It's not just Whitmore, it's every man who thinks his wife is property, every father who believes he owns his children. You're challenging the whole system, Caleb. That makes you dangerous. And dangerous men often end up dead or in prison, regardless of whether they're right." "I know. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to throw away everything you've built for a woman you haven't seen in 18 years and 2 children who aren't yours. That's noble, maybe. But it's also potentially stupid." Caleb glanced at the cabin, saw Lydia helping Emma with something, saw Sarah watching with the kind of desperate hope that came from finally believing she might be safe, saw a possible future that looked nothing like the lonely existence he'd been living. "Probably stupid," he agreed. "But I'm doing it anyway." Tom shook his head, somewhere between admiration and exasperation. "Then you'd better have a plan, because Whitmore won't quit. Men like him never do." They talked strategy as the stars emerged overhead. Tom laid out the legal realities, the challenges they'd face, the slim chances of making this stick. It wasn't encouraging. But Caleb had survived the war by understanding one fundamental truth. Sometimes you fought not because you could win, but because not fighting meant losing everything that mattered. This was one of those times. Tom left just after full dark, taking Daniel with him back to town under the pretext of needing the boy's formal statement. Before mounting up, the sheriff pulled Caleb aside one last time, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the cabin. 2 days, Caleb. Maybe 3 if I can stretch it. Use them wisely. What would you do if you were in my position? Tom considered the question, his eyes drifting to where Lydia stood silhouetted in the cabin doorway, backlit by lamplight. I'd find a way to make this legal. Marriage annulment, custody arrangement, something that gives you ground to stand on when Whitmore comes calling with lawyers and writs. Without that, you're just a man who stole another man's family, and no amount of moral rightness changes the law. How do I get an annulment when she's been married less than 2 days? Coercion, fraud. Prove Whitmore misrepresented himself in those letters, or that the marriage wasn't consummated, or that he threatened her into compliance. Any of those could work, but you'd need evidence, and you'd need it fast. Tom settled his hat more firmly. There's a lawyer in Denver Springs, name of Margaret Hartwell. She's handled cases like this before, helped women get out of bad situations. Might be worth the ride. Denver Springs is 2 days away. Then you'd better leave at first light. Tom swung into his saddle, gathered the reins. I'll hold Whitmore off as long as I can. But Caleb? He's already talking about bringing in territorial authorities, claiming you're dangerous, that you might hurt those girls. Once he gets official backing, my hands are tied. The weight of that settled over Caleb like a physical thing. Understood. He watched Tom and Daniel disappear into the darkness, then turned back toward the cabin. Through the window, he could see Lydia helping the girls prepare for bed, her movements gentle and maternal in ways that suggested this came naturally to her despite never having children of her own. Emma was already half asleep, curled against her sister. Sarah remained alert, watchful, as if waiting for the next danger to manifest. Smart girl. The danger was far from over. Inside the cabin felt smaller with 4 people occupying it, but also warmer somehow, more alive. Lydia had found his spare blankets and was arranging them on the floor near the stove where the heat would last longest through the night. The girls are asleep, she said quietly, or pretending to be. I think they're afraid if they close their eyes, they'll wake up back in that house. They're safe here. Are they? She straightened, faced him directly. Are any of us safe? I heard what Sheriff Briggs said about territorial authorities, about Whitmore's connections. This isn't over, is it? No, it's barely started. Caleb moved to the table, lowered himself into a chair with a grimace as his ribs protested. Tom suggested we ride to Denver Springs, find a lawyer who might help us get your marriage annulled. On what grounds? I said my vows willingly. No one forced me. Didn't they? You told me yourself you had $60 and nowhere to go. Whitmore represented himself as offering security and partnership. Instead, he locked you in a room within hours of the ceremony. That's fraud, Lydia. Misrepresentation of terms. She was quiet for a moment, processing this. And the girls? What grounds would we have for taking them? That's harder. Legally, they're his daughters. He hasn't been accused of any crime, hasn't been found unfit. We'd need them to testify about how he treated them, how he treated their mother, and even then, Caleb trailed off, the futility of it evident in his silence. Even then, a court would likely side with the father, Lydia finished, especially one with money and standing in the community. Maybe. But Tom seemed to think this lawyer, Margaret Hartwell, might have ideas we haven't considered. It's worth trying. Lydia crossed to the window, stared out at the darkness. I keep thinking about yesterday morning, how simple everything seemed. I was making a practical choice, securing my future. I thought I was being smart, pragmatic. Instead, I walked into a prison and dragged you in after me. You didn't drag me anywhere. I made my own choices. Choices that might cost you everything. She turned back to face him, and in the lamplight he could see tears tracking down her cheeks, though her voice remained steady. Your ranch, your freedom, possibly your life if Whitmore decides violence is his best option. All because you couldn't let go of a girl you loved 18 years ago. I'm not holding on to a memory, Lydia. I'm fighting for the woman standing in front of me right now, the one who survived losing her entire family, who endured years of hardship, who had the courage to escape when she realized she'd made a mistake. That woman is worth fighting for. Even if she's broken? Even if she's not who you remember? He stood, crossed to her, took her hands in his. They were rough from work, scarred from survival, nothing like the soft hands of the girl he'd known. They were better. Especially then. We're all broken, Lydia. The war broke me in ways I'm still discovering. But broken doesn't mean worthless. It just means we've survived things that should have destroyed us. She leaned forward, rested her forehead against his chest, and he felt the trembling that ran through her. Exhaustion and fear and relief all tangled together. His arms came around her carefully, mindful of his injuries, holding her while she finally allowed herself to fall apart. They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd loved and lost and somehow found their way back to each other across 18 years and countless miles. Outside, the prairie wind whispered against the cabin walls. Inside, two small girls slept fitfully, dreaming of rabbits and freedom. When Lydia finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear. "What time do we leave for Denver Springs?" "We?" Caleb shook his head. "You and the girls stay here. I'll ride out at dawn, be back in 4 days if I push hard." "Absolutely not. If we're doing this, we're doing it together. Those girls need to tell their story to someone who can help, and I need to file for annulment in person. We all go." "Lydia, it's 2 days hard riding. The girls can't—" "The girls can manage better than you think. They've endured worse than a long ride." Her jaw set in a way that reminded Caleb of the stubborn girl who'd once argued with him about everything from politics to the proper way to plant corn. "We're not sitting here waiting for Whitmore to show up with the law. We're taking action, together." He recognized the futility of arguing when she used that tone. "Then we leave before first light. Pack light, take only what's essential. If we're going to make Denver Springs in 2 days, we'll need to move fast." They spent the next hour preparing. Caleb gathered supplies, food, ammunition, blankets, the small amount of cash he kept hidden in a tin beneath a floorboard. Lydia woke the girls gently, explained the plan in quiet tones that somehow made a 2-day ride through uncertain territory sound like an adventure rather than a desperate flight. Sarah listened with that too-old understanding in her eyes. "Father will follow us." "Probably," Lydia admitted, "but we'll be ahead of him and we'll have help waiting in Denver Springs." "What if the help doesn't work? What if the law says we have to go back?" The question hung heavy in the small cabin. Lydia glanced at Caleb, a silent plea for the right words. "Then we figure out something else," he said. "But Sarah, I promise you this. You will never go back to living the way you were. Never. Whatever it takes to make that true, we'll do it. Even if it means running forever." The casual way she said it, like she'd already considered the possibility, already accepted it as preferable to the alternative, made Caleb's chest tighten. "It won't come to that." "But if it does?" He met her eyes, saw the need for absolute honesty. "Then, yes, even if it means running forever." She nodded, satisfied with the truth, even if it wasn't comfortable. Emma, still half asleep, asked if they could bring Billy the rabbit. When told they'd had to leave him behind, she cried quietly until Sarah promised they'd find her a new rabbit once they were safe. They left 2 hours before dawn, while the world still slept in darkness. Caleb had 2 horses now, his own mare and a gelding he'd been training to sell. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He took Sarah up with him, while Lydia rode with Emma. They moved quietly through the pre-dawn chill, following paths Caleb knew by heart, putting distance between themselves and the inevitable confrontation. The first day passed in a blur of riding and brief rests. They stopped only to water the horses and stretch legs cramping from long hours in the saddle. The girls bore it with remarkable stoicism, though Caleb could see the toll it took, Emma fighting tears, Sarah's face growing more pinched and pale as the hours wore on. By mid-afternoon, they'd covered nearly 40 miles. Caleb called a longer halt near a creek, letting the horses drink while he checked their surroundings. The landscape here was more broken, cut through with ravines and rocky outcroppings that could hide a dozen men if necessary. "Are we being followed?" Lydia asked, reading his tension. "Haven't seen anyone, but that doesn't mean much." He helped Emma down from the horse, watched her immediately curl up in the shade and close her eyes. "How are they holding up?" "Better than I expected, worse than I'd hoped." She stretched, working out kinks from her back. "We won't make Denver Springs by tomorrow night at this pace." "No, we'll need to camp somewhere between here and there, push through tomorrow." Caleb studied the terrain, calculating distances and risks. "There's a way station about 20 miles north, run by a widow named Anderson. She's tough as boot leather and doesn't ask questions. We could stop there, get a real meal, and a few hours of actual sleep. Will she turn us in if Whitmore comes asking? Martha Anderson? She once ran off 3 claim jumpers with nothing but a shotgun and profanity that would make a sailor blush. I don't think she'd take kindly to a man who locks up his wife and terrorizes his children. They reached the way station as evening painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. It was a sturdy structure, built to withstand prairie winters and summer storms, with a barn and corral that suggested Martha did decent business with travelers. The woman herself appeared on the porch as they rode up, tall and raw-boned, somewhere north of 60, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. "Caleb Mercer," she called out. "Haven't seen you in 6 months. Figured you'd died or gotten smart and left this godforsaken territory." "Neither. Just been busy." He dismounted, helped Sarah down. "Martha, I need a favor. A big one." She descended the porch steps, took in the scene with those sharp eyes, the exhausted children, Lydia's drawn face, Caleb's still healing injuries. "You in trouble?" "The kind that follows you." "The legal kind or the violent kind?" "Possibly both." Martha nodded once, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Get inside. Feed those young ones before they fall over. We'll talk after." The interior of the way station was clean and practical, with a large common room centered around a massive stone fireplace. Martha directed them to a table while she disappeared into the kitchen, returning with bowls of stew and fresh bread that made Emma's eyes widen. "Eat," Martha commanded. "You look half-starved, all of you." They didn't need to be told twice. The food was simple but substantial, exactly what they needed. Martha watched them eat with the assessing eye of someone who'd seen plenty of desperate folks pass through and knew the difference between trouble worth helping and trouble worth avoiding. When the girls had finished eating and were nodding off in their chairs, Martha pointed to a door off the main room. "2 beds in there. Clean linens. Get them settled." Lydia gathered the girls and disappeared through the door. Martha poured coffee, black and strong, and settled across from Caleb. "So, talk." He told her everything, the same story he'd told Tom, but with more detail about Whitmore's casual cruelty, the children's fear, the locked door and bruised wrists. Martha listened without interrupting, her expression growing harder with each revelation. When he finished, she took a long sip of coffee. "You know you've kicked a hornet's nest, don't you? Man like that, with money and pride both wounded, he won't stop until he's made you pay." "I know. And you're planning to fight anyway." "No other choice." "There's always a choice. You could put them on a train east, send them far enough that Whitmore couldn't follow, start over somewhere he'd never find them. And spend the rest of my life wondering if they were okay? If he'd found them? If those girls were safe?" Caleb shook his head. "No. We finish this properly or not at all." Martha's mouth quirked in something that might have been approval. "You're either noble or stupid, haven't decided which." "Can't I be both?" She actually laughed at that, a sound like gravel rolling down a hillside. "I suppose you can. All right, Mercer, you can stay the night. Rest up. But come dawn, I expect you gone before any trouble finds its way here. I like you well enough, but I'm not taking a bullet for you." "Understood." "Thank you, Martha." "Don't thank me. Thank whatever fool instinct makes me help every lost cause that wanders through my door." She stood, collected the empty bowls. "There's 2 more beds upstairs. You and the lady can figure out your own arrangements. Just keep it quiet. I need my sleep." Lydia emerged from the side room, closing the door softly behind her. "They're asleep. Actually asleep this time, not just pretending." "Good." Caleb stood, every muscle in his body protesting the movement. The long ride had aggravated his injuries, and exhaustion was catching up fast. "Martha's given us rooms upstairs." They climbed the narrow staircase to find 2 small but clean rooms with actual beds, luxury after the cabin floor. At the doorway to the first room, Lydia paused. "Caleb, I need to know something. What happens if we get to Denver Springs and this lawyer can't help? If there's no legal way to make this right?" He'd been asking himself the same question since they left. "Then we find another way. Move somewhere else, change our names, build a life outside the law if we have to." "You do that? Give up everything you've built here? Live as a fugitive, all for people you barely know? I know you, maybe not the life you've lived these past 18 years, but I know who you are at your core. That hasn't changed. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her face. And those girls in there? They've already survived more than most adults. They deserve a chance at something better. So yes, I'd do it, without hesitation. Lydia caught his hand, held it against her cheek. I don't deserve you. You deserve better than what you've gotten. From life, from Whitmore, from the world in general. I'm just trying to balance the scales a little. She pulled him closer, kissed him with a desperation that spoke to 18 years of loss and longing and roads not taken. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. This is complicated, she whispered. I know. We're technically committing crimes, multiple crimes. I know that too, and we might lose everything. Lydia. He rested his forehead against hers. I already lost everything once when I thought you were dead. Spent 18 years in a half-life, going through motions, building something that looked like a future but felt empty. I'm not going back to that. Whatever comes next, whatever price we have to pay, it's worth it to feel alive again. She trembled against him, not from fear but from the weight of finally being seen, being chosen, being fought for after years of simply surviving. Stay with me tonight, she said quietly. Just stay. I don't want to be alone. So he did. They lay together in the narrow bed, fully clothed, holding each other in the darkness while the prairie wind whispered its secrets outside. Neither slept much, both too aware of what tomorrow might bring. But the comfort of not being alone, of having someone to share the burden, made the sleeplessness bearable. Dawn came too quickly. They woke the girls, gathered their meager belongings, and found Martha already up with breakfast waiting, eggs and bacon, and more of that good bread. You've got maybe a 4-hour lead, she said as they ate. Ryder came through late last night asking questions. Well-dressed man, spoke like he was used to being obeyed. Told him I hadn't seen anyone matching your description. Caleb's hand tightened on his fork. Whitmore. Didn't give a name, but he had that look about him, the kind of man who thinks the world owes him whatever he wants. Martha refilled their coffee cups. He's tracking you hard. You'll need to move faster than yesterday if you want to stay ahead. They left within the hour, pushing the horses harder now that they knew Whitmore was close. The second day proved even more grueling than the first. Emma cried openly now, too exhausted to hide it. Sarah's face had gone gray with fatigue, but they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant being caught. Around mid-afternoon, Sarah suddenly tensed against Caleb's back. Someone's following us. He'd felt it too, that prickle at the base of his skull that meant they were being watched. He scanned the landscape behind them, caught a flash of movement about a mile back. A single rider moving fast. How long? Lydia asked, seeing his expression. Not long enough. He urged the mare faster. We need to reach Denver Springs before nightfall. It's our only chance. They rode hard for the next 3 hours, pushing horses and riders to their limits. The landscape gradually shifted from open prairie to more settled territory, farms appearing with increasing frequency, roads widening and improving, signs of approaching civilization. Denver Springs itself came into view as the sun touched the western horizon. It was larger than Redemption Falls, a proper town with multiple streets and substantial buildings. Caleb guided them straight to the center, looking for anything that might indicate a lawyer's office. A woman sweeping the boardwalk outside a general store pointed them toward a 2-story building on the main street. A sign proclaimed, Margaret Hartwell, attorney at law. They dismounted, stiff and exhausted. Caleb helped the girls down while Lydia approached the door, knocked with more confidence than she probably felt. A woman in her 40s answered, dressed in practical dark skirts and a white blouse, her graying hair pinned efficiently. She took in the bedraggled group with sharp, intelligent eyes. If you're selling something, I'm not interested. If you need legal help, my fee is $5 for a consultation. We need help, Lydia said. We need it desperately, and we need it now. And we have $5. Margaret Hartwell's expression shifted, professional assessment replacing initial dismissal. Then you'd better come in. They crowded into a small office lined with law books and case files. Hartwell gestured them toward chairs settled behind her desk with a notepad and pen. Start at the beginning. Leave nothing out. So they did. Caleb and Lydia took turns telling the story. The reunion, the hasty marriage, the locked room, the escape, Whitmore's pursuit. The girls added their own accounts of life under their father's control, voices small but steady as they described the rules and punishments and pervasive fear. Hartwell listened, taking notes occasionally, her expression giving nothing away. When they finished, she set down her pen and studied them in silence for a long moment. "This is a mess," she said finally, "a complete legal mess, but it's not hopeless. You can help us." Hope flared in Lydia's voice. "I can try. The marriage annulment is actually the easier part. Coercion based on misrepresentation, lack of consummation, evidence of immediate abuse. I can file that tomorrow morning and have a hearing within a week. The custody question is far more complicated." She turned her attention to the girls. "Sarah, Emma, if a judge asked you whether you wanted to live with your father or Mrs. Whitmore, what would you say?" "Mrs. Whitmore," both girls said simultaneously, without hesitation. "Even knowing that might mean never seeing your father again? Even if it means leaving the only home you've known?" "It was never a home," Sarah said quietly. "It was a place where we tried not to be noticed. Mrs. Whitmore is the first person since Mother died who looked at us like we mattered." Hartwell made another note. "All right, here's what we're going to do. First, I file for emergency protective custody of the children based on credible threat of harm. That's a stopgap measure, but it might buy us time. Second, we file for annulment of the marriage with supporting affidavits from everyone involved. Third, we petition for permanent custody arrangement that removes the children from their father's care." "Will it work?" Caleb asked. "Honestly, I don't know. The law heavily favors fathers in custody matters and husbands in marital disputes. We're fighting uphill against centuries of legal precedent. But the fact that Whitmore locked his wife in a room within hours of marriage, the visible bruising, the children's testimony, that gives us ammunition." She leaned forward, fixed them with a stern look. "But you need to understand, this fight will get ugly. Whitmore will hire lawyers, maybe better ones than me. He'll paint you as an adulterer and Mr. Mercer as a violent criminal who kidnapped his family. Every choice you've made will be scrutinized, twisted, used against you." "We know," Lydia said. "We're willing to risk it." "Are you? Because if we lose Mrs. Whitmore, you'll be legally bound to return to your husband. The children will be returned to their father, and Mr. Mercer will almost certainly face criminal charges for kidnapping, assault, and possibly more depending on how creative Whitmore's lawyers get." The weight of that settled over them. In the silence, they could hear the sounds of Denver Springs outside. Horses, wagons, people going about normal lives untouched by the drama unfolding in this small office. "What would you do?" Caleb asked. "If you were in our position?" Hartwell sat back, considered the question. "I'd fight. Because the alternative, letting men like Whitmore continue to treat their families as property with no recourse, that's unacceptable. But I'd go in with eyes wide open, understanding the odds, prepared for the possibility of failure." "Then we fight," Lydia said firmly. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs. We fight." The lawyer nodded, something like approval crossing her features. "Then we'll need to move quickly. File everything tomorrow, get hearings scheduled before Whitmore can outmaneuver us. In the meantime, you'll need somewhere safe to stay. Somewhere he can't find you easily." "We have money," Caleb started, but Hartwell waved him off. "Keep your money. You'll need it for court costs and fees. I know a boarding house run by a woman who's helped me with cases like this before. She doesn't ask questions, doesn't answer questions, and has a particular dislike for men who abuse their authority. I'll send word you're coming." They left the lawyer's office as full dark descended, following Hartwell's directions to a modest boarding house on the edge of town. True to her word, the proprietor, a stern woman named Mrs. Calloway, asked nothing beyond their names and how long they planned to stay. She showed them to 2 adjoining rooms on the 2nd floor, promised hot water for washing and a meal within the hour. Emma fell asleep almost immediately after eating, curled into a tight ball on one of the beds. Sarah lasted slightly longer, but exhaustion finally claimed her too. Lydia covered them both with blankets, smoothed hair back from small faces, then stood there watching them sleep with an expression that was part wonder, part fierce protectiveness. "They're already mine," she whispered, In every way that matters, they're my daughters now. The thought of them going back to him, they won't, Caleb said, though he couldn't promise that with any certainty. We'll find a way. Will we? Because I keep thinking about what Miss Hartwell said, about how the law favors fathers, about how we're fighting uphill. She turned to face him. What if trying to do this legally just hands him more ammunition? What if we should have just run when we had the chance? It's not too late. We could still disappear, head west to California or north to Canada, find somewhere he'd never think to look. You'd do that? Give up your ranch, your home, everything you've built? He moved closer, took her hands. I keep telling you, that ranch isn't home. It's just a place I've been existing. This, right here, with you and those girls in there. This feels like home, so yes, if running is what it takes, we run. And if we stay, if we fight and lose, then at least we tried. At least we stood up and said no to a system that treats people like property. Maybe we fail. Maybe it costs us everything, but maybe, just maybe, we win. And if we do, we set a precedent. We prove that men like Whitmore can be challenged. Lydia studied his face, searching for doubt or regret. You really believe that, don't you? That this matters beyond just us? I fought in a war that was supposed to be about principles, freedom, equality, the fundamental worth of every human soul. But when it ended, I looked around and realized that for half the population, nothing had really changed. Women were still property under the law. Children still belonged to their fathers, regardless of how those fathers treated them. We'd bled and died for principles we didn't even fully apply. He squeezed her hands gently. So yes, I believe this matters. This is how change happens, one fight at a time, one person standing up and saying, no more. You sound like a revolutionary. Maybe I am, or maybe I'm just a man who's tired of watching people suffer because the law says they have to. She kissed him then, soft and lingering, a promise of something neither of them could quite name yet. When they parted, her eyes were bright but determined. Then we stay, we fight, and we pray that justice means something more than just whatever the law says it means. They stood together in the dim room, holding each other while the night deepened outside and the town settled into sleep. Tomorrow, they would file papers and start legal proceedings that could make or break them. Whitmore would arrive with his own lawyers and accusations, and the real battle would begin. But for tonight, they had this moment of peace, this quiet certainty that whatever came next, they wouldn't face it alone. In the other room, two small girls slept without nightmares for the first time in months, dreaming of rabbits and safety and the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, they deserved to be loved instead of controlled. The fight was far from over. In many ways, it was only beginning. But they were ready. Morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything feel both more real and more fragile. Caleb woke to find himself in a chair by the window, his body protesting the awkward position. He'd stayed there through the night, keeping watch over the adjoining rooms where Lydia and the girls slept, half expecting Whitmore to materialize out of the darkness with a warrant and armed men. But the night had passed quietly, and now sunlight streamed through the boarding house windows, illuminating dust motes and the promise of a day that would determine everything. Lydia emerged from the girls' room looking more rested than she had in days, though tension still lined her face. They're still sleeping. I think yesterday finally caught up with them. Let them rest. We've got time before Hartwell's office opens. Caleb stood, worked the kinks from his neck and shoulders. You should eat something. Build up your strength for whatever today brings. Mrs. Calloway had breakfast ready in the dining room, eggs and potatoes and thick slices of bread with butter that tasted like luxury after days of trail rations. They ate in silence, both lost in thoughts about what the next hours would bring. Sarah and Emma appeared halfway through the meal, moving with the cautious uncertainty of children who still weren't quite sure this safety was real. Emma climbed into Lydia's lap without asking, and Lydia's arms came around her automatically, protectively. Are we going to see the lawyer lady today? Sarah asked, settling into her own chair with the careful precision she brought to everything. Yes, Lydia confirmed. She's going to file papers that say you shouldn't have to live with your father anymore, that you should be able to stay with me and Mr. Mercer. Will it work? The directness of the question deserved an honest answer. We don't know, but we're going to try our hardest to make it work. Sarah absorbed this with a small nod, then returned her attention to her breakfast. Emma remained in Lydia's lap, picking at food with one hand while the other clutched Lydia's sleeve like an anchor. They arrived at Margaret Hartwell's office just after 9. The lawyer was already at work, papers spread across her desk in organized chaos. She looked up as they entered, gestured them to seats. "I've drafted the preliminary motions," she said without preamble, all business in the morning light. Emergency protective custody for the children based on credible threat of physical and emotional harm. Petition for marriage annulment based on fraud, coercion, and evidence of immediate abuse. I need signatures from both of you, Mrs. Whitmore, and sworn affidavits from all 4 of you describing what happened. She passed documents across the desk. Caleb read through his carefully, aware that every word mattered, that this was the foundation they'd stand on when Whitmore came with his own accusations. "There's something else you should know," Hartwell continued as they signed. "I made some inquiries last night, called in favors with colleagues who've dealt with Whitmore before. Turns out your husband has a history." Lydia's head snapped up. "What kind of history?" "The first Mrs. Whitmore, Sarah and Emma's mother, she tried to leave him about a year before she died. Filed for legal separation on grounds of cruelty. The case never went to trial because she withdrew the complaint 2 weeks later. 3 months after that, she was dead." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah had gone very still, her small hands gripping the arms of her chair until her knuckles showed white. "What did she die of?" Caleb asked, though ice was already forming in his gut. "Officially? A fall down the stairs broke her neck. But there were whispers, rumors that the bruising didn't match the story. The local sheriff investigated briefly, but Whitmore had friends, influence. The whole thing was quietly buried." "He killed her." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried absolute conviction. "We never knew about the separation attempt, but we knew he hurt her. We heard them fighting, heard her crying, and then one day she was just gone. Father said it was an accident, that she'd been careless." "But you didn't believe him," Hartwell said gently. "Mother was never careless. She was careful about everything, had to be, living with Father. The idea that she'd just fall downstairs she'd climbed hundreds of times." Sarah shook her head. "Emma and I talked about it in whispers at night. We were too scared to say it out loud, but we both thought the same thing." Emma had started crying silently, tears tracking down her cheeks. Lydia held her tighter, her own expression a mix of rage and horror. "Can we prove it?" Caleb demanded. "Can we prove he murdered his first wife?" "Not without an exhumation and new investigation, which would require evidence we don't have and cooperation from authorities who've already chosen to look the other way." Hartwell's tone was pragmatic but sympathetic. "However, we can use the pattern of behavior. The previous separation attempt, the suspicious death, the immediate abuse of his second wife, it paints a picture of a dangerous man with escalating violence. That gives us leverage." "When does the hearing start?" Lydia asked. "I've requested an emergency session for this afternoon. Judge Morrison is fair, and she has a reputation for taking domestic matters seriously. If we're lucky, she'll grant temporary custody to you, Mrs. Whitmore, pending a full hearing. And if we're not lucky?" Hartwell met her eyes steadily. "Then the children go into state custody until the matter is resolved, or they're returned to their father if he can convince the judge he poses no threat." "No." The word came from Sarah, sharp and final. "I won't go back. Emma won't go back. If that judge tries to send us back, we'll run. We'll disappear and you'll never find us." The fierce determination in the 9-year-old's voice was startling. This was a child who'd already decided how far she was willing to go, what lines she was prepared to cross. Caleb recognized that look. He'd seen it in soldiers' eyes during the war, the moment they accepted that survival meant breaking rules they'd once held sacred. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Hartwell said. "But Sarah, if it does, if the worst happens, there are people who can help. People who've made it their mission to get children out of dangerous situations through whatever means necessary. I know some of them, so running wouldn't mean being completely alone." It was a careful statement, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply acknowledging reality. There were networks, Caleb knew, that operated outside the law's boundaries, people who moved abused wives and endangered children to safety when legal options failed. He'd heard whispers about such things, but never expected to be contemplating using them. They spent the next 2 hours preparing. Hartwell coached them on what to say and how to say it, warned them about the kinds of questions Whitmore's lawyers would ask, stressed the importance of staying calm no matter how ugly things got. "He'll try to provoke you," she told Caleb, "make you lose your temper in front of the judge. Don't give him that satisfaction. No matter what he says about you and Mrs. Whitmore, no matter what insinuations he makes, you stay composed. Understood?" "Understood." At 1 o'clock, they walked to the courthouse, a substantial stone building that represented civilization's attempt to impose order on the chaos of human conflict. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps and low voices, people moving between courtrooms where lives were being decided by strangers in black robes. Judge Morrison's courtroom was smaller than Caleb expected, almost intimate. The judge herself was a severe woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that suggested she'd heard every lie and seen every trick the legal system had to offer. They took their seats at one table while Hartwell organized her papers. The other table remained empty, but not for long. At precisely 2 o'clock, the door opened and Samuel Whitmore entered. He wasn't alone. 2 men in expensive suits flanked him, lawyers, clearly, with the kind of polish that came from prestigious schools and wealthy clients. Whitmore himself looked every inch the respectable citizen wronged by lawless elements. He'd cleaned up since their fight in the barn, wearing a dark suit that made him look distinguished rather than dangerous. Only the faint bruising on his jaw hinted at violence. His eyes swept the room, found Lydia and the girls, and something cold and possessive flashed across his face before he schooled his expression back to wounded dignity. "All rise," the bailiff called. "The Honorable Judge Margaret Morrison presiding." The judge entered, settled behind her bench with brisk efficiency, and fixed both tables with an appraising look. "We're here on an emergency motion for protective custody of 2 minor children, Sarah and Emma Whitmore, currently aged 9 and 7. We also have a petition for annulment of marriage between Samuel Whitmore and Lydia Hart Whitmore. Ms. Hartwell, you filed these motions. Make your case." Hartwell stood, commanding the room with practiced authority. "Your Honor, my clients fled Mr. Whitmore's household after Mrs. Whitmore was physically assaulted and forcibly confined to a locked room less than 12 hours after their marriage ceremony. The children were witnesses to this abuse and have testified to a pattern of controlling behavior, emotional cruelty, and credible threats to their safety. We're requesting emergency custody be granted to Mrs. Whitmore with supervised visitation only for Mr. Whitmore pending a full investigation." One of Whitmore's lawyers, the older one with silver hair and an air of courtroom superiority, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, Franklin Chambers representing Mr. Whitmore. These allegations are not only false but slanderous. Mr. Whitmore is a respected businessman and loving father whose wife and children were abducted by a violent criminal with an obsessive fixation. Far from being confined, Mrs. Whitmore left of her own volition with a man she'd been secretly meeting, using these poor children as pawns in an adulterous affair." The accusation landed like a slap. Lydia's hands clenched in her lap, but she held her composure. Caleb forced himself to breathe evenly, remembering Hartwell's warning about staying calm. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Chambers," Judge Morrison said dryly. "I assume you have evidence?" "We have Mr. Whitmore's sworn testimony that his wife and Mr. Mercer had a prior relationship, that Mr. Mercer was seen loitering near the train station when Mrs. Whitmore arrived, and that he subsequently appeared uninvited at their wedding. The very next day, he broke into Mr. Whitmore's home, assaulted him, and fled with his family. The pattern speaks for itself." "Ms. Hartwell?" "Your Honor, Mr. Mercer and Mrs. Whitmore did know each other 18 years ago, before the war. They lost contact and believed each other dead until Mrs. Whitmore arrived in Redemption Falls 2 days ago. There was no secret relationship, no adultery. Mr. Mercer came to Mrs. Whitmore's aid only after receiving a desperate message from her begging for help, because her new husband had locked her in a room." "I have that message, Your Honor." Hartwell produced the note Lydia had given Daniel, now preserved as evidence. Written in Mrs. Whitmore's hand, clearly stating she was imprisoned and afraid. Judge Morrison examined the note, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Chambers, Does your client deny locking his wife in her room? Chambers didn't miss a beat. Mr. Whitmore provided his bride with private quarters where she could rest after the stress of travel and wedding preparations. The door was closed for her comfort and privacy, not locked. That Mrs. Whitmore chose to characterize normal hospitality as imprisonment speaks to her unstable mental state. That's a lie, Lydia said, her voice cutting clear across the courtroom before Hartwell could stop her. He grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, told me I needed to learn my place, and locked me in that room with the explicit statement that I would remain there until I understood proper respect for my husband. Mrs. Whitmore, the judge said, not unkindly, please let your attorney speak for you. However, I would like to see these alleged bruises. Lydia stood, pulled back her sleeves to reveal the finger-shaped marks on her wrists, faded now, but still visible. The judge leaned forward, studied them carefully. Those could have come from anywhere, Chambers argued. Mr. Mercer himself shows signs of recent violence. Perhaps he inflicted those marks during the abduction to support this false narrative. It was a clever twist, turning evidence against them. Caleb felt anger rising but forced it down. Hartwell had warned him about this. Your Honor, Hartwell said, I'd like to call Sarah Whitmore to testify about conditions in her father's household. Objection, Chambers snapped. The child is 9 years old and easily influenced. Her testimony would be unreliable at best, coached at worst. She's old enough to describe her own experiences, Hartwell countered, and this court has a responsibility to hear from the children whose futures we're deciding. Judge Morrison considered this. I'll allow it, but keep your questions appropriate for her age, Ms. Hartwell. Sarah, please approach the bench. Sarah stood, walked to the witness chair with remarkable composure for a child her age. The bailiff administered the oath, which she took seriously, her hand steady as she swore to tell the truth. Hartwell approached gently. Sarah, can you tell the judge what life was like in your father's house? There were rules, Sarah said, her voice quiet but clear. So many rules. We couldn't speak at meals unless Father asked us a direct question. We couldn't leave our room without permission. We couldn't play or laugh or do anything that might disturb him. If we broke a rule, we didn't eat. Sometimes we were locked in our room for days. Did your father ever hurt you physically? He hit Emma once for dropping a plate, left a bruise on her arm that lasted 2 weeks. He hit Mother more often, usually where the marks wouldn't show. We heard it through the walls at night, her crying, him yelling, then silence that was worse than the noise. Objection! Chambers was on his feet. This is hearsay and speculation from a child who can't possibly understand what she heard. I understood enough, Sarah shot back, sudden steel in her young voice. I understood that Mother was afraid of him, that we were all afraid of him, that the day she died she had a fresh bruise on her face that Father said came from her fall, but we'd seen that kind of bruise before and knew where it really came from. The courtroom went silent. Even Chambers seemed momentarily at a loss. Whitmore's expression had gone dangerously blank, the kind of emptiness that preceded violence. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Sarah, this is important. Are you saying you believe your father was responsible for your mother's death? I don't believe it, Your Honor. I know it. I heard them fighting that morning. Heard him say she'd pushed him too far. Heard something that sounded like a struggle. Then I heard her scream and a loud crash. When we were finally allowed out of our room, Father said Mother had fallen down the stairs, but the stairs were behind us, in the opposite direction from where we'd heard the scream. The implications hung in the air like poison gas. Chambers looked genuinely shaken now, glancing at his client with what might have been doubt. Whitmore remained stone-faced, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. Your Honor, I move to dismiss these proceedings immediately, Chambers said, recovering his professional demeanor. This child has clearly been coached to make inflammatory accusations designed to prejudice the court. There was a full investigation into Mrs. Whitmore's death that found no evidence of foul play. An investigation conducted by a sheriff who was personal friends with Mr. Whitmore, Hartwell interjected. An investigation that lasted less than a week and concluded with suspicious haste. Your Honor, the pattern here is clear. A man who controls through fear and violence, who silences opposition through intimidation and influence, who views his family as property to be managed rather than people to be loved. These are wild accusations without substance, Chambers argued. Mr. Whitmore is the victim here, not the perpetrator. He opened his home and heart to a mail-order bride, only to have her stolen away by a violent criminal who broke into his house, assaulted him, and kidnapped his children. That this man and woman are now trying to paint my client as the villain is unconscionable. Judge Morrison held up a hand, silencing both lawyers. She looked at Sarah, still sitting in the witness chair with her small hands folded in her lap. Sarah, one more question. If I were to send you and your sister back to live with your father, how would that make you feel? The girl's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Terrified, Your Honor. Absolutely terrified. Not just of him, but of what we might become if we have to keep living in that house. Emma's already stopped talking most days. I already feel like I'm disappearing, like the parts of me that used to laugh and play and dream are dying because there's no room for them in Father's world. If we go back, eventually there won't be anything left of us worth saving. The raw honesty of it struck like a hammer. Even Chambers seemed affected, though he hid it quickly. Whitmore's expression had shifted from blank to quietly furious, his hands gripping the table edge hard enough that his knuckles showed white. Thank you, Sarah, the judge said softly. You may step down. Sarah returned to her seat beside Emma, who immediately grabbed her sister's hand. Lydia placed a protective arm around both girls, her own eyes wet with tears she refused to let fall. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers before her, the faces at both tables, the children huddled together as if preparing for a storm. This is not a simple matter, she said finally. The law gives fathers considerable rights over their children, and husbands considerable rights over their wives. Mr. Chambers is correct that legally, Mr. Whitmore has grounds for his complaints, but the law also recognizes that rights come with responsibilities, and that the state has an interest in protecting children from harm. She paused, and Caleb felt the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. Everything hinged on what came next. I'm granting temporary emergency custody of Sarah and Emma Whitmore to Lydia Whitmore, with the stipulation that they remain in Denver Springs pending a full custody hearing in 2 weeks. Mr. Whitmore will have no contact with the children during this period unless supervised by an officer of this court. As for the marriage annulment, I'm ordering a full investigation into the circumstances of the marriage, the allegations of abuse, and the death of the first Mrs. Whitmore. Until that investigation is complete, Mrs. Whitmore is to be considered a protected person under the court's jurisdiction, free to reside where she chooses without interference from Mr. Whitmore. Relief flooded through Caleb so powerfully it left him dizzy. Beside him, Lydia let out a shaking breath. The girls pressed closer together, not quite believing they'd been spared. But Whitmore was on his feet, his careful mask finally shattering. This is outrageous. You're taking my children based on the coach testimony of a disturbed child and the lies of an adulteress? You'll demand nothing in my courtroom, Mr. Whitmore. Judge Morrison cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. You'll sit down, control yourself, and accept my ruling. If you have objections, you may file them through proper channels. But if you make one move toward those children or Mrs. Whitmore, I'll have you arrested for contempt and hold you in jail until the full hearing. Are we clear? For a moment, Whitmore looked ready to explode. Then Chambers put a hand on his arm, whispered something urgent. Whitmore's jaw worked, but he settled back into his chair, radiating fury. We're adjourned, the judge said. 2 weeks from today, 10 o'clock. I expect all parties present and prepared for a full hearing. She stood, swept from the courtroom in a rustle of robes. The moment she was gone, Whitmore turned to face them across the courtroom. His eyes found Lydia first, then the girls, finally settling on Caleb with the kind of cold hatred that promised violence. This isn't over, he said quietly, the words carrying despite the distance between them. You think a judge's order protects you? You think I'll simply accept this theft of my family? You have no idea what I'm capable of. Actually, I think we have a pretty good idea, Caleb said, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Which is why we're not backing down. Chambers placed himself between Whitmore and them, a physical barrier against potential violence. Mr. Whitmore, we need to leave, now, before you do something that damages our case further. For a heartbeat, Whitmore looked ready to ignore his lawyer, to charge across the courtroom and damn the consequences. Then some survival instinct kicked in. He turned sharply and strode toward the exit, Chambers and the other lawyer hurrying to keep pace. At the door, he paused, looked back. 2 weeks, he said. Enjoy them. Because when this is over, I'll make sure all of you pay for this humiliation. Every single one. Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him with finality that felt more like a promise than an ending. Hartwell let out a breath she'd apparently been holding. Well, that went better than I expected, all things considered. Better? Lydia's voice shook. He just threatened us in open court. Yes, which was foolish of him. Judge Morrison doesn't take kindly to that sort of thing, and she'll remember it during the full hearing. Hartwell began gathering her papers with practiced efficiency. For now, you have 2 weeks of safety. Use them to prepare, to build your case, to show that you can provide a stable home for those children. We will, Caleb promised, whatever it takes. They left the courthouse into afternoon sunlight that felt surreal after the tension of the courtroom. Sarah and Emma stayed close to Lydia, both still processing the fact that they'd been heard, that someone with actual authority had chosen to protect them rather than send them back. Mrs. Whitmore? Emma's small voice was hesitant. Does this mean we get to stay with you? Really stay? For now, yes. And if we're very lucky and very strong, maybe forever. I'd like that, Emma said simply, then slipped her hand into Lydia's as they walked. They spent the remainder of the day settling into a new routine. Mrs. Calloway agreed to extend their stay at the boarding house, asking no questions about the drama unfolding in their lives. Hartwell connected them with a local doctor who documented Lydia's bruises officially, creating a medical record that would support their case. By evening, exhaustion had caught up with all of them. The girls fell asleep early, worn out by the day's emotional toll. Caleb and Lydia sat together in the boarding house parlor, speaking in low voices while the rest of the house settled into nighttime quiet. Do you think we can really win this? Lydia asked. 2 weeks from now, when we're back in that courtroom and Whitmore's had time to prepare better arguments? I think we have a chance, a real one. Judge Morrison saw through his facade. She heard what Sarah said and believed her. But belief and law aren't the same thing. You heard what she said. Fathers have considerable rights. Even knowing what kind of man he is, she might have to rule in his favor. Then we'll appeal. Take it to a higher court if necessary. Keep fighting until we find someone who'll prioritize those girls' safety over legal precedent. Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt the trembling that ran through her. I'm so tired, Caleb. Tired of fighting, tired of being afraid, tired of wondering if tomorrow's the day everything falls apart. How do you keep going when the whole world seems designed to beat you down? He thought about that, about the years after the war when he'd asked himself the same question, about the mornings he'd woken up and had to manufacture reasons to keep breathing, keep working, keep existing. You find something worth fighting for, he said finally, something that matters more than your own comfort or safety. For a long time, I didn't have that. I just went through motions, survived because stopping seemed like more effort than continuing. But then you stepped off that train, and suddenly I had a reason again. You and those girls, you're what keeps me going. You're what makes all of this worthwhile. Even if we lose, even if Whitmore wins and we end up with nothing, even then, because at least we tried. At least we stood up and said no to injustice. That has to count for something. She was quiet for a moment, then lifted her head to look at him. I love you. I don't know when it happened. Maybe it never stopped from 18 years ago, or maybe it's new, built from who we are now rather than who we were. But I love you, Caleb Mercer, and I need you to know that before anything else happens. The words settled into his chest like warmth on a cold night. I love you too. Always have, always will. Whatever comes next, we face it together. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet parlor while the night deepened outside. Somewhere out there, Whitmore was plotting his next move, preparing arguments and marshaling resources to reclaim what he saw as his property. The law stood ready to enforce his rights regardless of morality or justice. But for tonight, they had this victory, this moment of peace. This small family they'd built from desperation and hope, and the stubborn refusal to accept that might made right. 2 weeks until the next battle, 2 weeks to prepare, to build their case, to show the world that sometimes love and courage mattered more than legal precedent. They'd make those 2 weeks count. The 2 weeks that followed moved with strange duality, simultaneously crawling with anxious waiting and racing toward the inevitable confrontation. Caleb used the time to establish what stability he could, finding work at a lumber mill on the edge of Denver Springs that paid enough to cover their boarding house expenses and legal fees. The physical labor helped burn off the nervous energy that came from knowing Whitmore was out there somewhere, planning his counterattack. Lydia threw herself into mothering the girls with a fierce dedication that spoke to years of stored maternal instinct finally finding outlet. She enrolled them in the local school, walked them there each morning, and collected them each afternoon, creating routines that gave structure to their disrupted lives. Emma slowly began talking more, her silence thawing under consistent gentleness. Sarah remained watchful, cautious, but occasionally Caleb caught glimpses of the child she might have been in a different life, curious, intelligent, capable of joy when she let herself believe in safety. Margaret Hartwell worked tirelessly on their case, tracking down witnesses from Whitmore's past, building a documented history of controlling behavior and suspicious circumstances. She uncovered 2 former household workers willing to testify about the first Mrs. Whitmore's fear, about seeing bruises, about the oppressive atmosphere in that house. One, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd helped them escape, provided a particularly damning account of the locked room and Whitmore's cold rage. But Whitmore wasn't idle either. Word filtered back through Hartwell's contacts that he'd hired not just Chambers but 2 additional lawyers from back east, men with reputations for winning impossible cases through aggressive tactics and exploitation of legal technicalities. He'd also begun a quiet campaign among Denver Springs' business community, painting himself as a wronged husband victimized by frontier lawlessness, gathering support from men who saw in his situation a threat to their own patriarchal authority. The night before the hearing, Caleb found himself unable to sleep. He sat in the boarding house parlor, reviewing everything they'd prepared, searching for weaknesses Whitmore's lawyers might exploit. The scratching of pen on paper as he made notes was the only sound in the quiet house. "You'll wear yourself out if you keep this up all night." He looked up to find Lydia in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. She crossed to sit beside him, studied the papers spread across the table. "Just making sure we haven't missed anything," he said. "We've prepared everything we can. The rest is in the judge's hands now." She placed her hand over his, stilling the nervous movement of his pen. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to promise me something. Anything. If this goes badly, if the judge rules for Whitmore, I need you to take the girls and run. Don't wait for me. Don't try to fight the whole system. Just get them somewhere safe." "Lydia, promise me, Caleb. I can survive whatever happens to me. I've survived worse. But those girls," her voice caught, "they won't survive going back to him. Not intact. Not as the people they're meant to be. So promise me you'll save them, even if it means leaving me behind." The request cut deeper than any physical wound. "You're asking me to choose between you and them. I'm asking you to choose the people who need you most. Sarah and Emma have no one else. But I'm a grown woman who's made my own choices. If those choices mean paying a price, that's on me. The hell it is. You didn't choose abuse. You didn't choose to be locked in a room. You chose survival, and there's no shame in that." Caleb turned to face her fully. "And I'm not making any promises about leaving you behind, because we're not going to lose tomorrow. We can't. Too much is riding on this. You can't know that. Maybe not. But I can have faith that sometimes, just sometimes, the right thing wins out over the legal thing. Judge Morrison saw through Whitmore once. She'll see through him again." Lydia smiled sadly. "You have more faith in the justice system than I do." "Not the system, the woman. I saw how she looked at Sarah when she testified. That wasn't a judge hearing a case. That was a human being witnessing cruelty and being moved by it. Tomorrow, we remind her of that. We make it impossible for her to rule any way except in our favor." They sat together in the lamplight, drawing strength from each other's presence, until the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn. Then they roused the girls, dressed in their best clothes, and prepared for battle. The courthouse was more crowded this time. Word had spread about the case, and the public gallery filled with curious townspeople, reformers interested in women's rights, and businessmen whose presence suggested Whitmore's influence at work. Caleb spotted Tom Briggs near the back, the sheriff having ridden in from Redemption Falls to lend whatever support his presence might provide. Whitmore arrived with his legal team looking confident and composed, every inch the respectable citizen. He'd brought character witnesses, business associates, a pastor, prominent citizens who'd vouch for his standing in the community. They filled 3 rows behind his table, a show of force designed to intimidate. But Hartwell had assembled her own coalition. The former household workers sat ready to testify. A doctor who'd examined the first Mrs. Whitmore's body after her death and found the injuries inconsistent with a simple fall. 2 women from a Denver Springs charitable organization that helped victims of domestic violence. And Daniel, the boy who'd carried Lydia's desperate message, looking nervous but determined. Judge Morrison entered precisely at 10 o'clock, surveyed the packed courtroom with an expression that suggested she'd expected this circus. She settled behind her bench, waited for silence, then fixed both legal teams with a stern look. Before we begin, I want to make something clear. This is a court of law, not a theater. I will have order, I will have respect, and I will tolerate no outbursts from anyone regardless of which side they support. Mr. Chambers, Ms. Hartwell, call your witnesses and make your arguments. Let's proceed. Chambers stood first, smoothly confident. Your Honor, we'll demonstrate conclusively that Mr. Whitmore is a loving father and devoted husband who's been grievously wronged. His first wife's death was thoroughly investigated and found to be a tragic accident. His second marriage, while brief, was entered into with complete honesty and good faith. That his wife chose to abandon him after less than a day, taking his children and fleeing with a former paramour, speaks not to Mr. Whitmore's character, but to hers. He called Whitmore first, who took the stand with the kind of wounded dignity that played well to the gallery. Under Chambers' gentle questioning, he painted himself as a man trying to build a family after devastating loss, only to be betrayed by the woman he'd trusted and assaulted by a violent criminal. Mr. Whitmore, did you at any time lock your wife in a room? Chambers asked. Absolutely not. I provided her with comfortable quarters where she could rest after her journey. The door was closed for privacy, nothing more. If she felt confined, that was her perception, not my intent. And the bruises on her wrists? I have no knowledge of how those occurred. Perhaps during her voluntary departure with Mr. Mercer, who I remind the court is a man with documented history of violence. It was smooth, practiced, almost believable if you didn't know the truth. The gallery murmured approval, and Caleb felt cold dread settling in his stomach. Then Hartwell stood for cross-examination, and the temperature in the room shifted. Mr. Whitmore, you claimed the door to your wife's room was merely closed for privacy. Was there a key in that door's lock? Yes, as there is in all the bedroom doors. And where was that key the morning Mrs. Whitmore fled? A pause, barely perceptible. I don't recall. You don't recall? Because according to testimony from Mrs. Chen, your housekeeper, you kept that key on your person at all times after locking Mrs. Whitmore inside. Mrs. Chen is mistaken, or lying to protect herself after helping in the abduction of my children. We'll come back to that. Let's discuss your first wife. How did she die? As the official record states, she fell down the stairs and broke her neck, a terrible accident. Were you present when this accident occurred? I was in another part of the house. I heard a crash and found her at the bottom of the stairs. Hartwell produced a document. This is the coroner's report from your first wife's death. It notes bruising on her arms, face, and torso inconsistent with a simple fall. Can you explain those injuries? My wife had been ill. She bruised easily. The coroner noted it as unusual but drew no conclusions. Actually, the coroner noted it as suspicious and recommended further investigation. But that investigation never occurred, did it? Because you were friends with the local sheriff, and the whole matter was quietly dropped. Chambers was on his feet. Objection. Ms. Hartwell is making accusations without evidence, attempting to retry a case that was closed years ago. I'm establishing pattern of behavior, Your Honor, Hartwell countered. A pattern of violence covered up by influence and intimidation. Judge Morrison considered this. I'll allow it, but Ms. Hartwell, make your point quickly. Mr. Whitmore, 3 months before your first wife died, she filed for legal separation citing cruelty. Then she withdrew that filing. Did you coerce her into withdrawing? I did not. We reconciled. It was a difficult time in our marriage, but we worked through it. Worked through it by her dying 3 months later under suspicious circumstances? Objection. Sustained. Ms. Hartwell, you're approaching the line. Hartwell nodded, shifted tactics. Mr. Whitmore, what would you say is a father's role in his children's lives? The question seemed to catch him off guard. To provide for them, protect them, prepare them for the world. And how do you prepare them? Through education? Through love? Through teaching them to think independently? Through discipline and structure. The world is harsh. Children must learn to follow rules, to respect authority. And if they break these rules, what then? Another pause. There are consequences, as there should be. What kind of consequences, Mr. Whitmore? Withholding food? Physical punishment? Locking them in their rooms for days? I've never abused my children. No? Then perhaps you can explain why your daughter Sarah has scars on her back consistent with being struck with a belt, or why Emma stopped speaking for 3 months after her mother died, or why both children exhibit signs of severe anxiety and fear-based behavior patterns documented by the physician who examined them last week. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Chambers objected loudly. But the damage was done. The image of Whitmore as loving father was cracking, and everyone could see the ugliness underneath. Judge Morrison called for order, but her eyes had hardened as she looked at Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, you may step down. Miss Hartwell, call your next witness. The parade of testimony that followed built an irrefutable case. Mrs. Chen described the locked room, the girl's fear, the oppressive atmosphere of control that permeated the household. The doctor testified about injuries on the first Mrs. Whitmore's body that suggested defensive wounds, not accidental trauma. Daniel recounted delivering Lydia's desperate message, described the terror in her eyes. Then Sarah took the stand again, and this time she didn't hold back. With Hartwell's gentle questioning, she detailed years of abuse, not the dramatic kind that left visible scars, but the insidious, grinding cruelty of a parent who viewed children as possessions to be molded rather than people to be nurtured. She described meals eaten in silence, days spent locked away for minor infractions, the constant fear of doing something wrong without knowing what the rules were because they changed based on their father's moods. He killed our mother, Sarah said clearly, her young voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. Maybe not with his own hands directly, but he killed her spirit first, made her so afraid and so desperate that when she finally tried to escape, she ended up dead. And if we go back to him, he'll kill us too. Maybe not our bodies, but everything that makes us who we are. Please don't send us back, please. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Several people in the gallery were crying. Even Chambers looked shaken, though he recovered quickly. Your Honor, this child has clearly been coached. Mr. Chambers, Judge Morrison's voice cut like ice. I've presided over hundreds of cases involving children. I know coach testimony when I hear it, and I know genuine trauma when I see it. That child is not lying. She turned to Whitmore, who'd gone very still in his chair, his mask of respectability finally abandoned to reveal cold fury beneath. Mr. Whitmore, I've heard enough. Unless you have witnesses who can refute the pattern of behavior documented here today, I'm prepared to make my ruling. Chambers stood slowly. Your Honor, we have character witnesses prepared to testify to Mr. Whitmore's standing in the community. I don't care about his standing in the community. I care about his conduct in his home, toward his family. Character witnesses won't change what I've heard today. She paused, let that sink in. However, in the interest of thoroughness, I'll hear from one witness if you have someone who can speak directly to Mr. Whitmore's treatment of his children and wives. Not his business dealings or church attendance, but his actual behavior as a husband and father. Chambers conferred with Whitmore in urgent whispers. Caleb watched, saw the moment Whitmore shook his head, refusing something. The lawyer looked frustrated, but nodded. We have no such witness, Your Honor. Then I'm ready to rule. Judge Morrison straightened, gathered her papers, and fixed the courtroom with a look that demanded absolute attention. This case has forced me to consider the tension between legal precedent and moral imperative. The law gives fathers considerable authority over their children and husbands considerable authority over their wives. But the law also recognizes that authority is not absolute, that it can be forfeited through abuse and neglect. She paused, And in that silence, Caleb felt the weight of countless lives hanging in balance. Not just theirs, but everyone who'd ever been trapped in similar situations. Everyone waiting to see if the system could evolve beyond its patriarchal foundations. Based on the testimony presented, I find clear and convincing evidence that Samuel Whitmore represents a credible threat to the physical and emotional well-being of his daughters. The pattern of controlling behavior, the suspicious death of his first wife, the immediate abuse of his second wife, and the documented trauma exhibited by his children all point to a man fundamentally unfit for custody. Therefore, I am granting full permanent custody of Sarah and Emma Whitmore to Lydia Hart Whitmore, with no visitation rights for Samuel Whitmore unless and until he can demonstrate, through extensive counseling and behavioral change, that he no longer poses a threat. The courtroom erupted. Whitmore shot to his feet, his composure finally shattering completely. "You can't do this. Those are my children, my property under the law." "Your children are not property, Mr. Whitmore. They are human beings with rights of their own, including the right to safety, and you forfeited any claim to them through your conduct." Judge Morrison's gaze was steel. "As for the marriage annulment, I'm granting that as well based on fraud and coercion. The marriage is dissolved effective immediately. Mrs. Whitmore is free." "This is an outrage. I'll appeal. I'll take this to the Territorial Supreme Court. You'll do what the law allows, Mr. Whitmore. But I warn you now, any attempt to contact Mrs. Whitmore or those children, any harassment or intimidation, and I'll hold you in contempt and see you jailed. Do you understand?" Whitmore's face had gone purple with rage. For a moment, Caleb thought he might actually charge the bench, might let his fury override any remaining self-preservation. But Chambers grabbed his arm, physically restraining him while whispering urgently. "Court is adjourned," Judge Morrison declared, and swept from the bench before Whitmore could launch into another tirade. The gallery dissolved into chaos. Reformers celebrating, Whitmore's supporters protesting, reporters scrambling for the door to file their stories. In the middle of it all, Sarah and Emma sat frozen, as if afraid that moving might shatter this impossible victory. Then Lydia was there, gathering them into her arms, and both girls began to cry. Great shaking sobs of relief and release that seemed to carry years of held-back emotion. Caleb found himself pulled into the embrace, this makeshift family holding each other while the world spun around them. "It's over," Lydia kept repeating. "It's really over. You're safe. You're mine. It's over." Hartwell appeared at Caleb's elbow, her professional composure cracked by a genuine smile. "Congratulations. That's the most decisive custody ruling I've seen in a decade of practice." "Thank you," Caleb managed, "for everything. We couldn't have. You could have, and you would have. I just gave you the legal framework." She glanced toward where Whitmore was being escorted from the courtroom by his lawyers, still raging about appeals and injustice. "But this isn't completely finished. He will appeal, and he has the resources to drag this out for months. You need to be prepared for that." "We will be," Lydia said, surfacing from the embrace with the girls still clinging to her. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. We'll be ready." They left the courthouse into brilliant afternoon sunshine, stepping out into a world that felt fundamentally different than the one they'd entered. The battle wasn't over. Whitmore's threats of appeal weren't empty, but the immediate danger had passed. The girls were legally protected now, shielded by court order from the man who'd terrorized them. Tom Briggs met them on the courthouse steps, his weathered face creased in an approving smile. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually pulled it off." "Language," Caleb said mildly, nodding toward the girls. "Sorry, but heck, I didn't think Judge Morrison would rule that decisively. She must have really been convinced." "Sarah convinced her," Lydia said, tightening her arms around the girl in question. "She told the truth, and the truth was powerful enough to overcome legal precedent. So what now? You heading back to Redemption Falls?" Caleb and Lydia exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed it explicitly, but the answer felt obvious. "Eventually," Caleb said, "but first we need to make things official. Legal. All the way legal." "Official how?" Tom asked, though his knowing grin suggested he'd already guessed. "Lydia's marriage to Whitmore is annulled. She's free, and I've waited 18 years to do this properly." Caleb turned to Lydia, took her hands, aware that he was doing this in front of witnesses on courthouse steps with no planning or romance. It was perfect. "Lydia Hart, I loved you when we were kids who thought the world made sense. I loved you through a war that proved it didn't. I loved you through 18 years of believing you were dead. And I love you now, standing here with two incredible daughters and a future that's terrifying and uncertain and absolutely worth fighting for. Will you marry me? For real this time, for the right reasons, because you choose it and want it, and not because you're desperate or have no other options. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. You're asking me this now? Here? In front of half the town? I'm asking you this now because I can't wait another minute. Because life's too short and too unpredictable to waste time on perfect moments. Because this moment, messy and public and completely unplanned, is perfect enough. Then yes, absolutely yes. I'll marry you, Caleb Mercer, for all the right reasons and none of the wrong ones. He kissed her there on the courthouse steps while Tom applauded and the girls giggled and passersby stopped to witness this small moment of joy in a day that had held so much fear and uncertainty. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the Denver Springs Church, with Tom standing as witness and Sarah and Emma serving as flower girls with more enthusiasm than grace. Margaret Hartwell attended, along with Mrs. Calloway and several others who'd helped them along the way. It was nothing like the grand wedding Lydia had once imagined as a girl, and everything better, genuine, chosen, celebrated by people who'd fought alongside them rather than social obligation. The journey back to Redemption Falls took 4 days, traveling at a pace that accommodated children and celebration rather than desperate flight. They stopped at Martha Anderson's way station again, where the stern woman actually smiled upon hearing about the court's ruling and pressed fresh-baked pies into their hands for the journey. Caleb's ranch looked smaller when they finally arrived, the cabin obviously inadequate for a family of 4. But Sarah and Emma explored it with delight, finding joy in the simplicity and space after the oppressive grandeur of their father's house. Emma discovered a family of rabbits living in the barn and declared it the best home she'd ever seen. It needs work, Caleb admitted, surveying his property with new eyes. A lot of work. Expansion, repairs, proper beds for the girls, a real kitchen. Then we'll work, Lydia said simply. We'll build what we need, together. That's what families do. And they did. Through the remainder of that summer and into fall, they transformed the homestead from a lonely bachelor's survival station into an actual home. Caleb added 2 rooms to the cabin with help from neighbors who'd heard about the court case and admired what he'd done. Lydia planted a garden and taught the girls to tend it, creating something beautiful from the stubborn earth. Sarah threw herself into school with fierce dedication, making up for lost time. Emma slowly emerged from her shell, her natural curiosity and joy reasserting themselves as the months of safety accumulated. Whitmore did appeal, as predicted. But each motion was denied, each attempt to reverse Judge Morrison's ruling rejected by higher courts that increasingly recognized the validity of her arguments. After 6 months, even his expensive lawyers advised him to abandon the effort. The legal battle was truly over. The first winter tested them in different ways. Emma fell ill with pneumonia, and for 3 terrifying weeks they fought to keep her alive through fever and labored breathing. Lydia never left her side, maintaining vigil through endless nights while Caleb rode through snowstorms to fetch the doctor. When the fever finally broke and Emma opened her eyes asking for soup, the relief was so profound that Caleb found himself crying for the first time since the war. Sarah had nightmares occasionally, waking screaming from dreams where her father dragged her back to that locked house. But Lydia was always there, holding her until the terror passed, reminding her that she was safe, that the law had spoken, that Whitmore had no power over her anymore. Spring came eventually, as it always did, bringing warmth and new growth and the sense of possibilities unfolding. Caleb's herd had grown. His land was producing better yields, and the ranch was becoming prosperous enough to support them all comfortably. More importantly, it was filled with life and laughter and the kind of ordinary domestic chaos that came from children being allowed to be children. One evening in late spring, Caleb found Lydia sitting on the porch while the girls played in the yard, Emma chasing butterflies while Sarah read aloud from a book of poetry. The setting sun painted everything gold and rose, and for a moment the scene looked like something from a dream rather than hard-won reality. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling beside her. "How far we've come. How impossible all of this seemed just a year ago." She leaned against him, comfortable in the silence. Do you ever regret it? Taking on all this chaos when you could have had a quiet life? Every day, he said, then smiled at her alarmed expression. I'm joking. No, Lydia. I don't regret a single moment. This chaos, as you call it, is everything I didn't know I needed. Those girls out there, you beside me, this life we're building, it's worth every risk we took. Even the parts where we almost lost everything? Especially those parts, because they proved what we were capable of when everything was on the line. They proved that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Sarah looked up from her book, caught them watching. Mr. Mercer, can we get chickens? Emma wants eggs for breakfast, and I read that chickens aren't too difficult to keep. We can look into it, Caleb called back. But you two will be responsible for feeding them and collecting eggs. We can do that, Emma declared, abandoning her butterfly chase to rush over. We can do anything. The simple confidence in that statement, so different from the terrified whispers of a year ago, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. These children who'd been taught to make themselves small and invisible were learning to take up space, to ask for things, to believe that their wants and needs mattered. That night, after the girls were asleep, Caleb and Lydia sat together reviewing the account books, planning for the future. There were decisions to make about crop rotation and livestock purchases, practical matters that grounded them in the daily work of building a life. I've been thinking, Lydia said, setting down her pen, about the other women out there in situations like mine was, like the first Mrs. Whitmore was. Women trapped in marriages with no way out, children suffering in silence because the law says their fathers own them. Margaret Hartwell mentioned there are organizations working on these issues, reform movements trying to change the laws. I know, and I want to help, not right now. We have enough on our hands, but someday. When we're more settled. I want to use our story, use what we learned, to help other people escape situations like ours. Caleb studied her face, saw the determination there. This was the woman who'd survived loss and hardship and come out stronger, who'd found the courage to flee an abusive marriage even when it meant risking everything. Of course, she'd want to help others do the same. Then we'll do it, he said. When the time is right, we'll find ways to help. Tell our story, support the reformers, maybe even testify before legislatures if that's what it takes. We've got proof that the system can change when good people push hard enough. That's worth sharing. Years passed, marked by seasons and growth and the slow accumulation of ordinary miracles. Sarah grew into a serious young woman with ambitions of becoming a lawyer herself, inspired by Margaret Hartwell's example. Emma developed a talent for drawing, filling sketchbooks with images of the prairie and animals in her family. Both girls bore scars from their early years, but they were healing, learning that the past didn't have to define the future. Caleb and Lydia expanded the ranch, became respected members of the community, raised their daughters with a combination of love and structure that bore no resemblance to Whitmore's authoritarian control. They fought sometimes, disagreed about decisions, struggled through difficult periods like any family. But they faced it all together, choosing each other again and again the way Caleb had once promised. Word reached them eventually that Whitmore had left Colorado, moved back east where his reputation hadn't been completely destroyed. Some said he'd remarried, found another woman to control. Others said he'd become a recluse, bitter and isolated. Caleb found he didn't care much either way. Whitmore was part of the past, and the past had no power over them anymore. On their 5th anniversary, Caleb found Lydia in the garden she'd spent years cultivating, watching Sarah and Emma help with the harvest. The girls were teenagers now, confident and capable, bearing little resemblance to the terrified children who'd fled their father's house. 5 years, Lydia said as he joined her. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Sometimes it feels like no time at all. 5 good years, 5 years of building something that matters. He pulled her close, kissed her temple. And hopefully 50 more just like them. 50 years of chaos and struggle and never quite enough money and worrying about the girls and all the rest of it? Exactly that. Every messy, imperfect, absolutely perfect bit of it. She laughed, the sound free and genuine. Then here's to 50 more years, to building something from nothing, to proving that love can be stronger than law, that courage can overcome precedent, that families are built not by blood or legal contract, but by choosing each other every single day. I'll drink to that. And they did. That evening around the dinner table with Sarah and Emma and neighbors who'd become like family, celebrating not grand triumphs, but the quiet victory of having survived and thrived, despite everything stacked against them. The frontier was still harsh, the world still unjust in countless ways, the legal system still weighted toward the powerful and privileged. But in this one corner of Colorado, on this one small ranch, love had won, courage had prevailed. A family forged in crisis had become something unbreakable. Caleb Mercer had spent 18 years and a half-life, convinced his chance at happiness had died before it truly began. Lydia Hart had survived loss and hardship and a desperate marriage that nearly destroyed her. Sarah and Emma Whitmore had endured abuse and terror that would have broken many adults. But together, they'd built something extraordinary from those broken pieces. Not because they were special or blessed or lucky, but because when faced with the choice between accepting injustice and fighting for something better, they'd chosen to fight. Again and again, through every obstacle and setback, they'd chosen each other and the life they wanted to build. Years later, when Sarah stood before Judge Morrison, now elderly but still sharp, to be sworn in as Colorado's youngest female attorney, Caleb and Lydia watched from the gallery with Emma between them. Sarah's acceptance speech talked about the day she'd testified as a 9-year-old, about the judge who'd chosen justice over precedent, about parents who'd shown her that courage meant standing up even when the law said you were wrong. They taught me, Sarah said, her voice carrying to every corner of that same courtroom where her life had been decided, that law should serve justice, not the other way around. That rules are only as good as the principles behind them, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up and say no, when everyone else is telling you to accept injustice as inevitable. In the gallery, Emma squeezed Lydia's hand. Caleb put his arm around both of them, this family they'd fought so hard to protect and preserve. Around them, other families sat, some they knew, some strangers, all connected by the simple fact that they lived in a world slowly, painfully, learning that authority without accountability was tyranny, that might didn't make right, that every person deserved dignity and choice, regardless of gender or age or station. The fight wasn't over, would probably never be completely over, but it was being won, one case at a time, one family at a time, one person standing up and refusing to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. That night, back at the ranch that had grown from a lonely cabin into a true homestead, Caleb and Lydia sat on their porch while the stars emerged overhead. 50 years hadn't quite passed, but they were well on their way. Gray threaded through their hair now, and their hands bore the marks of decades of hard work. But they were together, they were happy, and the family they'd built was thriving. "Do you remember," Lydia asked, "that first day when I stepped off the train and you looked like you'd seen a ghost? I thought I had, thought the universe was playing the cruelest joke imaginable. And now? Now I think it was the universe giving us a second chance, giving us what we should have had the first time if the world hadn't gotten in the way." He pulled her closer. "I'd go through it all again, every moment of fear and uncertainty and risk, to end up right here. Even the part where you got beaten up in a barn? Even that, though my ribs still remind me about it when the weather changes." She laughed, and the sound carried across the prairie they'd tamed together, this land they'd made into a home through sheer stubborn determination. Inside the house, lights glowed warm against the darkness. Their daughters' voices drifted out, Sarah reading aloud from a legal brief she was working on, Emma critiquing some fine point of argument. This was what they'd fought for, not wealth or status or recognition, but this simple, profound reality. A family built on choice rather than obligation, on love rather than control, on the revolutionary idea that every person deserved the right to determine their own destiny. The past had tried to destroy them. The law had tried to separate them. Fear and doubt and impossible odds had tried to convince them that fighting was futile. But they'd fought anyway, had won against all probability, had built something beautiful and lasting from desperate circumstances and impossible choices. And in doing so, they'd proved that sometimes, just sometimes, love really was stronger than law, that courage really could overcome precedent, that the future really could be different than the past if you were willing to fight hard enough, believe stubbornly enough, and never ever accept that injustice was inevitable. Caleb Mercer and Lydia Hart had found each other twice across 18 years and countless miles. They'd fought battles legal and personal. They'd risked everything for a family that existed outside traditional boundaries. And they'd won. Not perfectly, not without scars, not without cost, but completely, absolutely, forever. The frontier night settled around them, vast and star-filled and full of promise. Somewhere out there, other families were struggling. Other people were fighting their own battles against systems designed to keep them powerless. The work was never finished. But for tonight, in this moment, on this porch, with this woman beside him, and these daughters inside, and this life they'd built from nothing, Caleb Mercer was exactly where he was meant to be. Home. Finally, truly, unshakably home.